The briefing room sat 3 levels below the Pentagon's public face where fluorescent lights hummed against soundproofed walls and the air tasted of recycled cold. Captain Maya Reynolds stood at attention before the projection screen, her dress uniform crisp despite the early hour, while Colonel Harris circled the classified folder on the metal table like a predator assessing wounded prey. Asset Tango Whiskey. The designation appeared on screen in red block letters, accompanied by grainy satellite footage of Pacific Northwest wilderness terrain so dense the canopy swallowed light. Harris spoke without turning from the images. 20 years ago, a Special Forces colonel went dark during a classified training exercise in Washington state. Official record lists him as KIA training accident remains unrecovered. His name was Ethan Wolfe. The photograph that followed showed a man in his early 30s, West Point ring, visible on his left hand, Ranger tab and Special Forces insignia stitched above a chest heavy with commendations. Blue eyes that looked through the camera rather than at it, the kind of gaze Maya recognized from her grandfather's old unit photos, soldiers who'd seen things that changed the math on what it meant to survive. 20 years is a long time to stay dead, sir. Harris finally faced her. Intelligence suggests otherwise. We've had sporadic reports from the region. Large predator sightings, unusual territorial behavior evidence of organized activity in the restricted zone. 2 months ago, a logging crew found equipment cached in a cave system military grade, properly maintained, showing signs of recent use. The screen cycled through inventory photos. Radio equipment, decades out of date but meticulously cared for medical supplies stored with field hospital precision, topographic maps annotated in handwriting that matched samples from Wolfe's service record. The Pacific Northwest Pac established a 15-mile exclusion zone around that wilderness immediately after Wolfe's disappearance. They claim the area is contaminated, dangerous, off-limits to everyone. For 2 decades, they've enforced that perimeter with armed patrols. Question becomes, what are they protecting people from, or what are they keeping contained? Maya studied the maps, noting the professional way terrain features were marked, approaches analyzed, defensive positions identified. Someone trained is living in that zone. The question is whether it's still Colonel Wolfe or what's left of him after 20 years alone. Harris opened a second folder, this one thinner, stamped with clearances that made Maya's own look pedestrian. What I'm about to tell you exists in exactly 4 copies. Project Valkyrie was a black-budget program run in the late 90s attempting to enhance soldier performance through supernatural genetic integration. Werewolf DNA gene therapy controlled exposure protocols. Wolfe volunteered during his SF years. Initial results were promising: enhanced strength, accelerated healing, improved sensory capabilities, all while maintaining full human cognition. The implications crystallized until something went wrong. Until he inherited PAC leadership from his father and became a political complication. A special forces operator with experimental enhancements, taking command of a sovereign supernatural community, Pentagon brass decided that was a national security risk they couldn't accept. Maya kept her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. So they terminated the asset. They tried. Final injection was supposed to be fatal. Make it look like the enhancements caused catastrophic organ failure. Except Wolfe survived, transformed into something between human and wolf, and disappeared into that wilderness. The PAC leadership at the time claimed he'd gone feral, a mindless beast too dangerous to contain. They established the exclusion zone, and everyone moved on. Everyone except the families who'd lost someone to cover up the program's failures. Maya's grandfather had been Wolfe's senior NCO, executed the same week for what the official record called treason, though the details remained conveniently classified even after 20 years. Harris pulled a single photograph from the folder, placed it carefully on the table. Sergeant Major James Reynolds in dress uniform, medals spanning 3 decades of service, standing beside a younger Colonel Wolfe at some formal military function. Both men looked like they understood exactly what it cost to wear those decorations. Your grandfather served as Wolfe's right hand for 5 years. The official story is that he was complicit in whatever got Wolfe killed, that he betrayed classified information to enemy elements. Except the timing is interesting. James Reynolds was executed 72 hours after Wolfe disappeared, before any investigation could even determine what happened in those woods. Maya had been 15 when her grandfather died, old enough to remember the stone-faced officers who came to the door, the closed casket funeral, the way her grandmother refused to cry in front of the soldiers who'd served with her husband. Old enough to know that the man who'd taught her to shoot to track, to think tactically before acting, that man hadn't been a traitor to anything except maybe an inconvenient truth. "What's my mission, sir?" Harris's expression shifted into something almost sympathetic. "We need assessment of Asset Tango Whiskey. If Colonel Wolf is alive and maintains any operational capacity, we determine whether he's salvageable for service or represents a continued threat that needs permanent resolution. You'll insert solo cover as a lost hiker, make contact if possible. 72 hours to evaluate and report back. And if he's beyond recovery," the silence answered before Harris spoke, "you're authorized to use terminal force if the asset proves irretrievable and poses clear danger to national security. Containment protocols are included in your mission package." Maya felt the weight of her grandfather's service jacket pressing against her consciousness, the official lies that had poisoned his legacy, the questions that had followed her through West Point and intelligence school and every assignment since. If Wolf was alive, if he knew what really happened 20 years ago, then maybe the truth could finally surface in something other than whispered speculation. "When do I leave?" "Helicopter insertion at 0500 tomorrow. Nearest road access is 10 miles from the exclusion boundary. We'll drop you there. Civilian camping gear as cover, real equipment concealed in your pack. Encrypted sat phone with emergency extraction protocols. Your call sign for this operation is Raven 6. Harris slid the mission folder across the table. "One more thing, Captain. Project Valkyrie officially doesn't exist. If this goes sideways, if Wolf is what they say, and you don't make it back, the story is you went hiking on leave and got lost in the mountains. Your family gets a folded flag and the same polite lies everyone else receives. Are we clear?" Maya picked up the folder, felt the weapon authorization forms underneath the intelligence briefs, wondered how many other soldiers had walked into classified death sentences carrying gear that would disappear from inventory logs before their bodies cooled. "Crystal clear, sir. I'll find out what happened to Colonel Wolf. And if someone murdered my grandfather to cover up a failed experiment, I'll make sure that truth doesn't stay buried another 20 years. The helicopter lifted into pre-dawn darkness 3 hours later, rotors beating steady rhythm against mountain air that tasted of pine and coming snow. Maya sat alone in the cargo bay civilian pack beside her containing enough camping equipment to sell the lost hiker story, tactical gear sewn into hidden compartments that would pass visual inspection, but not a serious search. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset with coordinates and weather updates, professional distance from whatever mission she was walking into. The mountains below looked like broken teeth in the instrument lights, old-growth forest so dense it swallowed civilization's attempts at roads or power lines. This was land that remembered when humans were prey, when wolves hunted in packs large enough to challenge anything that walked, and the modern world's claims of dominance grew thin as the altitude climbed. Insertion point appeared as a clearing barely large enough for controlled descent, meadows surrounded by trees that hadn't been logged when the Constitution was signed. Maya fast roped down, felt the ground solid beneath her boots, signaled the all clear, while rotor wash flattened the grass in concentric circles. The helicopter lifted immediately, running lights disappearing behind the ridgeline, and then she stood alone in silence, so complete her ears rang, trying to find sound to process. First light came slow gray, seeping into black, revealing terrain that matched her topographic maps but felt different in 3 dimensions. The meadow sloped west toward the exclusion zone, deer trails cutting through underbrush water, running somewhere close enough to hear but not see. Maya oriented herself, using compass and map, marked her position with GPS coordinates, then started moving with a methodical pace that 8 miles without exhausting the hiker who walked them. The civilian cover meant moving slower than her training demanded, stopping frequently to study plants she could identify in her sleep, taking photographs of nothing in particular, maintaining the facade of someone enjoying nature rather than infiltrating a classified military disaster. But her real attention tracked other signs, the absence of human trash this close to accessible wilderness, no trail markers or cairns built by bored day hikers, an emptiness that suggested people knew to avoid this area even if they couldn't articulate why. 3 miles in, she found the first territorial marker, a tree stripped of bark at exactly 6 feet claw marks, scoring deep into the wood, recent enough that sap still bled from the wounds. Maya photographed it from multiple angles, noted the spacing between individual gouges, estimated the size of whatever made them. large, powerful, methodical in the way it had worked around the trunk. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was a message territory, claimed boundaries, established consequences, promised for those who ignored the warning. She crossed into the exclusion zone at noon. No physical barrier marking the boundary, but the change was immediate. The forest here felt different, watched like walking through a space where invisible eyes tracked every step. Birds went quiet. Small animal sounds that had provided background noise to the morning's hike disappeared. Even the wind through the trees seemed muted, as if the wilderness itself held its breath, waiting for violence. Maya moved carefully now, all pretense of casual hiking abandoned senses, sharpened into the tactical awareness, drilled through countless training exercises and 2 combat deployments. She checked sight lines, identified cover positions, maintained awareness of her back trail, reading the terrain like text that might save her life if she understood the grammar. The first night she made camp in a defensible position, back to a rock face, clear lines of sight in 3 directions, fire small enough to provide warmth without advertising her presence to anything beyond a quarter mile. She ate MRE instead of the camping food packed for show, maintained watch rotation. Even sleeping alone, listened to night sounds that slowly returned as the forest decided she wasn't an immediate threat. Nothing approached. Nothing challenged her presence. But twice she caught scent on the wind that raised every instinct her grandfather's training had honed: musk and meat, and something underneath that her hindbrain recognized as predator, even if her conscious mind couldn't name it. Day 2 brought evidence that someone maintained this wilderness with intention. She found a deer carcass hung properly to drain meat harvested with knife work that showed skill hides stretched on a frame built to cure it, nothing wasted in the way soldiers learned to treat scarce resources. Whoever lived here understood fieldcraft, respected the animals that fed them, approached survival with discipline rather than desperation. The cave system appeared on her map as geological notation: limestone formations carved by millennia of water flow, but the entrance she found mid-afternoon showed signs of habitation that satellite imagery couldn't capture. The natural opening had been subtly modified, positioned to catch southern exposure for warmth, drainage channels cut to prevent flooding, vegetation cleared just enough to allow approach while maintaining concealment from aerial observation. Maya approached with weapon drawn, safety off finger, resting outside the trigger guard because shooting first meant mission failure, but dying stupid meant never reporting back. She moved tree to tree, studied the entrance for tripwires or deadfalls, watched for any indication that her approach had been detected. The voice came from behind her, speaking with a command authority that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the part of her brain trained to respond to officers who'd earned obedience through competence rather than rank. "You've been watching me for 3 days, Captain. Military bearing tactical movement, counter-surveillance protocols that aren't taught in civilian hiking courses. So let's skip the part where you pretend to be lost and I pretend to believe you. What does Army intelligence want with a dead man?" Maya spun weapon tracking to center mass on the target, training taking over before her conscious mind processed what she saw. The figure stood 20 feet distant, positioned where shadow met sunlight, massive enough that her first assessment tagged it as threat requiring immediate suppression. Then the details registered: bipedal stance, human intelligence in eyes that reflected light like an animal's military bearing, visible despite physical transformation, hands that ended in claws but were raised in the universal gesture of no threat intended. She kept the weapon steady, fingers still off the trigger, buying seconds to think. "Colonel Ethan Wolfe, I need to talk." The figure shifted, moving from shadow into fuller light, and Maya saw what 20 years of survival had done to the Special Forces officer in her mission briefing. The transformation was extensive: wolf features overlaid on human bone structure, body mass, increased to something that would mass close to 300 pounds muscle definition, visible even through thick fur that covered most exposed skin. But the eyes were wrong for a mindless beast, focused and aware, tracking her weapon with the recognition of someone who understood exactly what a rifle could do and had calculated whether he could close the distance before she fired. "Reynolds." His voice carried resonance that didn't quite fit human vocal cords, words formed carefully around a mouth not built for speech. "James had a granddaughter in the service. He talked about you. Said you were sharper than half his officer corps, that you'd make colonel before 40 if the system recognized talent over politics." The weapon felt heavy in her hands, pointed at someone who'd known her grandfather well enough to remember conversations about family. "What happened to him?" The official record says treason, but the details are classified above my clearance level. All I know is that he died the same week you disappeared, and nobody could explain why a decorated sergeant major with 30 years of service would suddenly betray his country. Wolf lowered his hands slowly, non-threatening, and Maya saw the calculation in his eyes whether to trust her with truth that could get them both killed, whether blood connection to James Reynolds meant anything after 20 years, whether she'd been sent to extract information or simply eliminate a problem that should have died in these woods decades ago. Your grandfather died because he wouldn't let them bury the truth about what they did to me. Walk with me, Captain. If you're going to kill me on orders, at least know what you're executing first. He turned and moved into the cave entrance, trusting her to either follow or shoot him in the back, both options leaving her holding consequences. Maya considered her mission parameters: the authorization for terminal force in her pack, the encrypted phone that could call extraction if the asset proved beyond salvaging. Then she thought about her grandmother's face at the funeral, the way she'd looked at the flag-draped coffin, and whispered, "I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry. They made you die for being right." She followed. The cave system opened into spaces that satellite thermal imaging could never capture: chambers carved by ancient water flow, natural architecture modified with human ingenuity. What struck Maya first was the organization: military footlocker against one wall, radio equipment arranged on shelves with the precise spacing of someone who'd internalized equipment checks, maps pinned to surfaces, with tactical annotations that showed active intelligence gathering, sleeping area maintained with field discipline that wouldn't have looked out of place in any forward operating base. This wasn't a beast's den. This was a command post maintained by someone who'd refused to let transformation destroy their training. Wolf moved to a camp stove, started water heating with movements that showed careful control of claws, not designed for fine manipulation. Coffee, its instant supplies are limited, but some rituals are worth maintaining even when you're living in a cave. Maya lowered her weapon, didn't holster it, kept it ready, but not immediately threatening. Start from the beginning. My briefing said you volunteered for Project Valkyrie, that you were enhanced, and something went wrong. They tried to cover it up by saying you'd gone rogue, and my grandfather got caught in the purge. But I need to hear what really happened in your words before I decide what to do with the information. The water boiled. Wolf poured 2 cups, added instant crystals, handed one to Maya, with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to control strength that could crush steel. He settled onto a camp stool, massive frame making the equipment look designed for children, and the sound that escaped him might have been a laugh or a growl or some hybrid that represented what he'd become. Project Valkyrie approached me 8 years into my Special Forces career. The pitch was compelling: serve your country, push human limits, help develop capabilities that could save American lives. Minimal risk, they said, all testing done on volunteer basis, full disclosure of potential side effects. I was 31, invincible in the way young soldiers are figured, that if the risk was worth taking, someone should take it, and better me than some private who didn't understand what he was signing up for. He sipped the coffee, grimaced, continued. They didn't lie about the science. Werewolf genetics combined with targeted gene therapy controlled exposure to supernatural elements, carefully monitored integration. For 6 months, the results were everything they promised: enhanced strength, accelerated healing, sensory improvements, all while maintaining full human cognition and control. I was faster, stronger, could operate with less sleep, recover from injuries that would have sidelined me for weeks. The program looked like exactly what they'd claimed. Maya listened, hearing echoes of her grandfather's voice in the clinical way Wolf described military operations, the soldiers' tendency to compartmentalize horror into factual briefing. So what changed? My father died. Heart attack sudden, left me to inherit pack leadership at 32 years old. Became AlphaKing of the Northern Pack, which meant going from experimental subject to sovereign leader of a supernatural community. Suddenly, the Pentagon had an enhanced soldier with political authority over several thousand American citizens who happened to be werewolves. That made certain people nervous. He set the cup down with exaggerated care. I informed my council about Project Valkyrie, believed in transparency, thought that if I was going to lead people with experimental enhancements or running through my blood, they deserved to know what kind of risk I represented. My executive officer at the time was Victor Grant. We'd served together for 10 years, trusted each other with our lives a dozen times over. He seemed supportive, told me it showed integrity to disclose the program, that the pack would respect my honesty. The words came harder now, memories that clearly still carried weight. 2 months later, during a routine medical check, they gave me what they called a booster shot, maintenance injection to keep the enhancements stable. Except the compound they used wasn't maintenance. It was Protocol Omega, a termination sequence designed to cause catastrophic system failure that would look like the enhancements had simply pushed my biology past sustainable limits. Maya's hand tightened on her weapon. They tried to murder you. I woke up 48 hours later in restraints transformed into what you see now. Cognitive function fractured, barely human. Victor stood over me with the council showing them forged correspondence that claimed I'd been planning to weaponize the pack, turn us into a military asset for hostile foreign powers. Evidence of treason, communications with enemy elements, detailed plans that looked damning as hell because they'd been created by intelligence professionals who understood exactly how to build a plausible case. He stood moved to the footlocker, pulled out a folder so worn the edges had gone soft. Inside were service records, commendations, photographs of younger men in uniforms that represented a world Maya understood. One photo showed Wolf and her grandfather at some formal event, both in dress uniform, both looking like they'd spent careers building trust that couldn't be faked for cameras. The council voted 8-2 for exile. Execution by silver injection supposed to be fatal within minutes. Your grandfather was one of the two who voted no. So was Lieutenant Morrison, a good man who believed in evidence over expedience. But Victor had forged documents, had the council convinced that letting me live represented existential threat to the pack. Maya's voice came rough. What happened to my grandfather? James wouldn't accept it. Started investigating the injection source, traced the compound to a Pentagon black site, found documentation showing Project Valkyrie was never about enhancing volunteers. We were test subjects for weapons development, experimental assets to be terminated if we became politically complicated. He discovered that Victor had been paid $2 million to eliminate me when I inherited PAC leadership, that the entire conspiracy traced back to the same people who'd promised me I was serving my country. He opened a second folder, this one containing pages that Maya recognized as classified document formatting. James tried to present his evidence to the council. Victor's men killed him before he reached the chambers. Shot him in the back, claimed he'd pulled a weapon and forced their hand. Official record listed him as co-conspirator in my treason, executed while resisting arrest. His evidence disappeared, his service record was purged of anything that contradicted the narrative, and his family got a folded flag, and the military's practiced condolences. The walls felt too close, air too thin, truth too heavy to process standing up. Maya sat hard on a supply crate, mind racing through implications that reached back 20 years and forward into her mission parameters. Do you have proof, anything that survived beyond your testimony? James said he hid encrypted files. Told me that if anything happened to him, someone would find them, that he'd made sure the truth couldn't be buried forever. But he never told me where, probably figured they'd torture the location out of me if I knew better to keep it secret, even from the people he was trying to protect. Maya pulled out her sat phone encryption protocols that should keep Pentagon signals intelligence from monitoring the call, but probably wouldn't. She accessed military archives database search parameters, narrow enough to avoid suspicion, looking for storage records attached to her grandfather's service number. The results loaded slowly, satellite bandwidth constrained, but when they appeared, she felt something cold settle in her chest. Personal effects stored at Fort Lewis Vault 7 Delta. Never claimed by family, never reviewed by anyone with authority to unseal them, sitting in a numbered box for 20 years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. I can access those effects. Family hardship exemption request, a review of items held in storage. If your evidence exists, if James really did hide files that prove what happened, then maybe we can finally drag this into the light. Wolf's expression shifted into something that might have been hope or might have been anticipation of further disappointment. And if the evidence supports my version, what then, Captain? You report back that the mission target is a wrong soldier rather than a threat requiring elimination. They'll either bury you with the truth or send you right back here with orders to finish what they started. Maya stood, checked her weapon, made sure the safety was engaged before she holstered it. My grandfather died trying to expose a crime. If the Pentagon thinks I'm going to walk away from that just because it's convenient for people who murdered good soldiers to cover up a failed experiment, they seriously underestimated what it means to be James Reynolds' granddaughter. She headed for the cave entrance, paused, looked back at the massive figure, watching her with eyes that still reflected too much light. I'll be back in 72 hours. If the files exist, if they prove what you've said, then we finish what my grandfather started. Nobody gets to murder decorated soldiers and walk away just because they've got classified stamps on their conscience. This drive to Fort Lewis took 6 hours through mountain roads that dropped her back into civilization like surfacing from deep water. Maya checked into a budget motel, showered away 3 days of wilderness, changed into clean civilian clothes, then headed to the base with paperwork that should get her access to Storage Vault 7 Delta if the duty officer didn't look too closely at why an active duty intelligence captain was requesting effects from a sergeant major executed for treason 20 years previous. The clerk barely glanced at her credentials, pulled records, verified her relationship to James Reynolds, then handed her a claim ticket. Vault 7 Delta, Section 12, Row 8, Box 347. You've got 2 hours before we close for the day. Need help carrying anything out? I'll manage. The storage vault smelled of cardboard and time rows of numbered boxes containing the abbreviated lives of soldiers who died or retired or disappeared into the vast machinery of military bureaucracy. Maya found Box 347 exactly where the indexing system promised, lifted it from the shelf, carried it to a private review room. Inside, dress uniforms, carefully folded medals in presentation cases, photographs spanning 3 decades of service letters from commanders praising James Reynolds' dedication and skill. And underneath everything, wrapped in a t-shirt from some long-forgotten training exercise, an external hard drive from the late 90s when storage capacity was measured in megabytes and encryption was simpler. Maya connected it to her laptop, watched security protocols engage, saw the password prompt appear with cursor blinking expectation. She tried obvious combinations first. Family birthdays, service numbers, important dates from James's career. Nothing worked. The encryption was military grade, designed to resist casual attempts, probably configured with lockout protocols that would wipe the drive after enough failed attempts. What would he want Wolf to know? What password would her grandfather choose that meant something to the man he died protecting? She typed Wolf's service number followed by the date James had enlisted. Combination that only made sense if you knew both men's military history. Sequence that represented decades of service and friendship and trust. The drive unlocked. The files were organized with the same precision James had brought to every aspect of his career. Documents sorted by category, each folder labeled clearly evidence, arranged in chronological order, showing exactly how the conspiracy had unfolded. Maya read through it methodically, professional distance crumbling as she absorbed the scope of what had been done. Project Valkyrie overview. Pentagon authorization at the highest levels, budget in 9 figures. Goal stated explicitly as weaponizing supernatural genetics for military advantage. Test subjects recruited from Special Operations Community Consent Forms buried in legal language that technically disclosed risks while practically ensuring nobody understood what they were signing. 12 subjects total. Wolf designated as Subject 07, others listed only by number. Subject 07 file recruitment noted as voluntary with asterisk referencing consent documentation. Enhanced performance metrics tracked weekly results consistently exceeding projections. No adverse effects noted through 6 months. Then notation dated 3 weeks after Wolf inherited PAC leadership, subject compromised through political elevation. Recommend protocol Omega activation. Victor Grant's collaboration agreement, signed document showing $2 million transferred to offshore accounts, payment terms, explicit eliminate. Subject 07, when he becomes AlphaKing, frame as treason, suppress all evidence of program involvement. Justification stated clearly in bureaucratic language. Supernatural enhanced national leader represents unacceptable security risk to federal authority. James Reynolds' after-action report. Written 48 hours before his death, detailed timeline of everything he'd discovered, names of everyone involved, financial transactions, forged documents, meeting logs showing conspiracy reach to assistant secretary level. Final paragraph handwritten in her grandfather's familiar script. If you're reading this, I'm dead. Colonel Wolf was betrayed by his government and his executive officer. He deserves justice. Give him that. SMSG. James Reynolds. Maya sat in the storage vault reading until the lights automatically dimmed for closing time, then copied everything to encrypted drives, 3 copies stored in separate locations. Belt and suspenders redundancy that her grandfather had taught her before she was old enough to understand why backup systems mattered. Then she returned the box to its shelf, thanked the clerk, walked to her car with evidence that could destroy careers and reputations and comfortable lies that had held for 20 years. The drive back to the insertion point took until after dark, mountain roads, empty headlights, cutting tunnels through wilderness that pressed close. Maya thought about mission parameters, authorization for terminal, force-encrypted phone in her pack that could call extraction and report that Asset Tango Whiskey represented continued threat requiring permanent resolution. She thought about her grandfather's final words handwritten because he'd known they'd kill him before he could speak them, trusting that someday someone would care enough to look. She thought about Wolf living in a cave for 20 years, maintaining military discipline alone, refusing to let transformation destroy what he'd been, even when every reason existed to embrace the monster they had tried to create. The meadow where she'd inserted appeared in her headlights, empty and peaceful, giving no indication of the classified violence that had occurred here or the reckoning about to unfold. Maya made camp not civilian pretense anymore, but military efficiency, checked her weapon, verified her sat phone encryption, then settled in to wait for dawn. At first light, she moved back into the exclusion zone, 3 days of trail signs already familiar, moving faster now without pretense of casual hiking. The cave entrance appeared mid-morning, and Wolf stood outside it as if he'd been waiting, massive figure, relaxed but alert posture, suggesting he'd tracked her approach long before she came into view. She pulled out the encrypted drive, held it up. My grandfather hid everything. Names, dates, financial records, signed agreements, the complete conspiracy. He documented it all before they killed him, and he was right. Someone did find it eventually. Wolf's expression shifted through emotions too fast to track: hope, grief, vindication, rage, settling finally on grim determination. Then we have proof. Everything they did, everyone involved, the whole rotten structure exposed. We have enough to burn down their careers and probably land a few people in Leavenworth if we can get it to the right authorities. But that's complicated when the authorities are the ones who authorized the murders in the first place. She moved to sit on a boulder, gesture for Wolf to join her, 2 soldiers planning operations in terrain that didn't care about their ranks or missions or the weight of injustice they carried. My orders were to assess and eliminate if necessary. Report back within 72 hours with recommendation for continued containment or terminal resolution. Instead, I'm sitting here with evidence of Pentagon conspiracy to murder American soldiers, and the only witness who can testify about what happened is legally dead and physically transformed beyond what most courts would recognize as credible testimony. Wolf settled nearby, careful to maintain distance that didn't make her instincts scream threat. So what do you recommend, Captain? Because from where I'm sitting, the options are limited. I can't exactly walk into a congressional hearing looking like this and expect anyone to take me seriously. They'd label me a security threat, lock me up for study, or just put a bullet in my head and classify the whole thing as threat elimination. Then we don't go to Congress. We go public, leak the files to journalists who specialize in military cover-ups, make it too big to bury quietly. Your appearance becomes evidence rather than liability, physical proof that Project Valkyrie created exactly the kind of danger they were supposedly trying to prevent. She pulled out her sat phone, fingers hovering over the power button, knowing that once she made contact, the mission clock started ticking toward either extraction or elimination. But first, I need to know one thing. After everything they did to you, after 20 years alone in these woods, after watching my grandfather die, trying to expose the truth, do you want justice or do you want revenge? Wolf was quiet long enough that Maya started calculating whether she'd miscalculated his stability, whether the man she'd been talking to was about to fracture into the beast her briefing had described. Then he spoke words, careful and measured soldier who'd thought deeply about the question long before she'd arrived to ask it. James would want justice. He believed in the system even when the system failed him, believed that good soldiers had an obligation to fix institutions rather than burn them down. He died trying to work within protocols, trying to present evidence to people with authority to act on it. If I pursue revenge, I dishonor his sacrifice. If I want to finish what he started, I do it his way. Evidence first, trial second, accountability. through proper channels, even when those channels are corrupted. Maya powered on the sat phone, watched it search for signal, felt the weight of what she was about to do settling across her shoulders. Then we're going to need help from inside the system. Someone with enough rank to make people listen, enough integrity to risk their career on a 20-year-old conspiracy. And we're going to need more than just documents. We need testimony from people who can verify what happened, witnesses who will stand up under cross-examination. The phone found signal, chirped, ready cursor, blinking expectation. Maya pulled up her contact list, found the name she needed, composed a message that would either start the process of accountability or paint a target on her back that wouldn't wash off. Colonel Harris Asset, Tango Whiskey Assessment requires immediate secure communication. Have recovered evidence suggesting cover-up of experimental program murder of U.S. soldiers conspiracy reaching Pentagon level. Request face-to-face briefing before filing official report. Current assessment. Asset represents no threat, previous threat evaluation based on manufactured intelligence. Standing by for instructions. Raven 6. She hit send, watched the message encrypt and transmit, then powered down the phone before anyone could track the signal back to her location. Now we wait. Either Harris is one of the good ones who will actually want to know what happened, or he's part of the problem and I just told him exactly where to send the cleanup team. Wolf's laugh held no humor. And if it's the cleanup team, Maya checked her rifle, verified the magazine, chambered around with smooth mechanical precision. Then they're going to learn that James Reynolds' granddaughter inherited more than his commitment to truth. They want to eliminate problems with bullets, they better bring enough ammunition. The response came 6 hours later, encrypted message loading slowly on the sat phone screen. Secure facility meeting authorized. Extraction team inbound to your position, ETA 4 hours. Bring all evidence, prepare for detailed debriefing. Do not attempt to bring asset to secure location. This is not negotiable. Harris and Maya read it twice, analyzed the phrasing, looked for hidden meanings in what wasn't said. He wants me to come alone. Leave you here, bring the evidence, trust that they'll process it properly and act with integrity. Which means either he's legitimate and concerned about operational security, or he's compromised and planning to disappear you along with the evidence the moment you're in custody. She stared at the message, at the blinking cursor, waiting for her response, at the choice that would determine whether her grandfather's sacrifice meant anything or simply became another classified casualty buried in a storage vault for the next generation to discover. Then she started typing, composing words that would either save them both or kill them both, but wouldn't leave any ambiguity about where she stood. Negative on solo extraction. Asset Tango Whiskey comes with me or I don't come at all. Evidence includes testimony from sole surviving witness. His presence is non-negotiable. If Pentagon can't handle seeing what they created, maybe they shouldn't have authorized Project Valkyrie in the first place. Provide secure facility coordinates that accommodate enhanced asset, or I leak everything to WikiLeaks in 12 hours. Your choice. Raven 6. She showed the message to Wolf before sending. Last chance to walk away. Once I send this, we're committed. They'll either meet our terms or come after us with everything they've got. Wolf read it, nodded slowly, expression suggesting he'd made peace with whatever came next long before Maya had arrived to ask the question. Your grandfather trusted me with his life. I'm trusting you to finish what he started. Send it. Maya hit transmit, watched the message encrypt and launch into satellite network, then powered down the phone and started breaking camp with practiced efficiency. We've got maybe 4 hours before they respond or send a team. Either way, we should be mobile when they arrive. Defensive position, good sight lines somewhere we can spot trouble before it spots us. They moved to high ground overlooking the meadow insertion point position that gave clear view of anyone approaching while providing multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated. Wolf moved through the forest with surprising silence for his size military training, overriding physical transformation, every step calculated to minimize sound and disturbance. The sat phone chirped after 3 hours, message loading with frustrating slowness. Request approved with conditions. Secure facility. Bravo 7 prepared for enhanced asset accommodation. Extraction team inbound with specialized transport ETA 90 minutes. Asset must agree to restraints during transport for safety protocols. This is non-negotiable for facility access. Do you accept terms? Harris Maya looked at Wolf. saw the calculation in his eyes, the soldier's assessment of risk versus reward. They want you restrained. Security protocols, they'll say, but also gives them control if this goes wrong. Standard procedure for transporting enhanced assets. I'd require the same thing in their position, makes tactical sense, even if it leaves me vulnerable. The phone waited for a response, cursor blinking impatience. Maya's hand hovered over the keys, thinking about her grandfather's trust about soldiers who died believing the system would eventually find justice, about the choice between perfect security and the possibility of accountability. She typed terms accepted. Asset cooperates fully with transport protocols. But if this is a setup, if we get to your facility and find black site interrogation instead of proper debriefing, understand that I've distributed copies of all evidence to 3 separate sources with instructions to publish everything if I don't check in every 12 hours. You can kill us, but you can't kill the truth of anymore. Evan 6. The helicopter arrived exactly 90 minutes later, different from the civilian aircraft that had inserted her, this one clearly military, despite the absent markings. It settled into the meadow rotors, maintaining power, while a security team deployed 4 soldiers in tactical gear is surrounding a figure Maya recognized from the Pentagon briefing room. Colonel Harris approached alone, hands visible posture, suggesting he understood exactly how precarious this situation had become. He stopped 30 feet distant, close enough to talk, without shouting far enough that neither Maya nor Wolf felt immediately threatened. Captain Reynolds, Colonel Wolf, I'm here to provide transportation to a secure debriefing facility where we can examine evidence and determine appropriate action. The restraints are necessary for transport protocol, standard procedure for any enhanced asset, nothing personal. You have my word that you're not walking into a black site. Maya stepped forward, keeping Wolf in peripheral vision, maintaining situational awareness that had kept her alive through 2 combat deployments. Your word means something only if you've got the authority to back it up. Who authorized this facility access? Who's going to be in the debriefing room? Because if we get there and find the same people who authorized Protocol Omega sitting across the table, Colonel Wolf and I are walking out regardless of what your security team thinks about it. Harris pulled out a tablet, called up documentation, held it where they could see. Facility commander is Major General Patricia Morrison, 2-star, with impeccable record, no connection to Project Valkyrie or any of the principals named in your preliminary report. Debriefing panel includes judge advocate general representatives, inspector general investigators, and Congressional Armed Services Committee staff. Everyone involved has been vetted specifically to ensure no conflict of interest. He gestured back toward the helicopter. I can't promise this ends the way you want. I can't guarantee that powerful people won't try to bury it again. But I can promise you'll get a fair hearing in front of people who care more about truth than protecting careers. That's the best I can offer, and it's more than anyone's gotten in 20 years of trying to expose what happened. Maya looked at Wolf, saw the decision forming behind the eyes that still reflected too much light, the soldier who'd survived 2 decades alone, accepting one final calculated risk, because the alternative was living in hiding until someone eventually hunted him down. We go, but the evidence stays distributed, and if anything happens to us, it all goes public. You're betting that the system can actually deliver justice. We're betting that bet isn't going to get us killed. The restraints were heavy-duty polymer designed for enhanced strength, locking around Wolf's wrists with mechanisms that probably cost more than Maya's annual salary. He submitted to them without resistance, soldier following protocols even when those protocols left him vulnerable, trusting that his gamble on Harris's integrity wasn't about to become another classified failure. They loaded into the helicopter security team, maintaining professional distance, weapons ready, but not immediately threatening. The aircraft lifted into afternoon sky rotors, beating steady rhythm, while the exclusion zone fell away below 20 years of exile, ending in a helicopter ride toward either justice or another betrayal. Maya kept her hand near her sidearm, not threatening, but ready, watching the security team for any indication that this was about to become a black site rendition instead of a proper debriefing. Wolf sat motionless, restrained but not defeated expression, suggesting he'd made peace with whatever came next, somewhere in the long years of surviving alone. Harris sat across from them, tablet balanced on his knee, reviewing documents that Maya recognized from her grandfather's encrypted files. After 20 minutes of silence, broken only by rotor noise, he looked up. Met Wolf's eyes with expression that might have been apology or might have been respect, for what 2 decades of survival represented. For what it's worth, Colonel, reading these files makes it clear you got fucked over by people who should have protected you. You volunteered to serve your country, they turned you into a weapon, then tried to eliminate you when you became politically complicated. That's not how we're supposed to treat soldiers who've given everything to the mission. Wolf's response came quiet but clear. Your apology means something only if it leads to accountability. Otherwise, it's just words trying to smooth over murder and conspiracy. James Reynolds died trying to expose this. His granddaughter risked her career to finish what he started. If this debriefing ends with more classification stamps and polite lies, then nothing changes and we're right back where we started. The helicopter flew east for 2 hours mountain terrain, giving way to high desert isolated facility, appearing as cluster of buildings that could have been ranch or research station or any of 100 other installations scattered across federal land. They landed on a helipad positioned away from main structures. Security protocols suggesting this place was designed for exactly the kind of sensitive debriefings that couldn't happen in public view. Major General Morrison waited in the operations center, 2 stars on her collar expression, suggesting she'd built her career on competence rather than politics. She saluted as they entered, gesture that included both Maya and Wolf, acknowledging them as soldiers regardless of current status. Captain Reynolds, Colonel Wolf, welcome to Forward Operating Base Sentinel. This facility exists specifically for situations where standard protocols are inadequate. Whistleblower protection, classified evidence, evaluation, investigations into military misconduct. You're going to tell me everything that happened 20 years ago, and I'm going to make sure the right people hear it. She gestured toward a conference room visible through reinforced glass. Inside, you'll find representatives from JAG Inspector General and congressional oversight. Your testimony will be recorded, transcribed, and entered into official record. The evidence you've provided will be analyzed by forensic specialists. And when we're done, recommendations will go up the chain of command with authority to actually implement consequences. Maya felt tension she hadn't realized she carried start to ease fractionally. And if those recommendations include criminal charges against Pentagon officials, if the evidence points to conspiracy and murder at levels high enough that people will want it buried. Morrison's smile was cold and professional. Then those people are going to learn that Major General Morrison doesn't bury evidence to protect careers. I've spent 30 years building a reputation for integrity, and I'm not about to compromise it for officials who authorize murder to cover up a failed experiment. Your grandfather tried to work within the system, Captain. Let's prove he was right to have faith in it. The debriefing lasted 14 hours, breaking only for meals and rest testimony, recorded from every angle while specialists examined documents and verified their authenticity. Maya walked them through the timeline from her initial mission briefing through the evidence recovery, explaining methodically how each piece connected to build a picture of conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Project Valkyrie's command structure. Wolf provided his testimony with military precision, starting from his Special Forces service through Project Valkyrie recruitment enhancement protocols, his inheritance of PAC leadership, the injection that was supposed to kill him, Victor Grant's betrayal, and James Reynolds' discovery of the truth. He spoke for 6 hours straight, answering every question, providing details that only someone who'd lived through it could know, building a case that couldn't be dismissed as fantasy or fabrication. The JAG representatives took careful notes, asking pointed questions about consent protocols, evidence of premeditation, specifics of how Victor's collaboration was documented. The Inspector General investigators focused on the cover-up, tracing how evidence had been suppressed, how James's murder was justified, how the conspiracy had remained hidden for 20 years. When they finally broke for the night, Morrison pulled Maya aside in the corridor, expression suggesting the general had reached conclusions that wouldn't please everyone involved. Your grandfather was right about everything. The evidence is irrefutable, the testimony is credible, and the conspiracy goes exactly as deep as he documented. We've got signed agreements showing Pentagon officials authorized payment to eliminate an American soldier for political convenience. That's murder, conspiracy, abuse of authority, and probably a dozen other charges that will take prosecutors months to sort through. She handed Maya a secure tablet loaded with preliminary analysis. I'm recommending immediate criminal investigation, special prosecutor appointment, congressional hearings, and full review of any remaining classified programs that might involve human experimentation. Colonel Wolf will be given full exoneration, restoration of rank, and compensation for 20 years of wrongful exile. And your grandfather will be posthumously cleared of all charges, his service record corrected, and his family provided with formal apology from the Department of Defense. Maya felt something break loose in her chest that might have been grief, or might have been relief, or might have been the simple recognition that justice delayed wasn't always justice denied. When does this go public? As soon as we brief congressional leadership, probably 48 hours, maybe less, if the committee chairs move quickly. After that, it's national news, and people are going to demand accountability. Some careers are going to end, some officials are going to face criminal charges, and the military is going to have to reckon with the fact that we authorized murder to protect a program that never should have existed in the first place. In the temporary quarters they had been assigned, Wolf sat on a bed designed for humans, looking absurdly large in the confined space expressions, suggesting he was processing 20 years of survival, suddenly transformed into validation. Maya sat across from him, exhaustion pulling at her consciousness, but mind too active to consider sleep. James would have liked seeing this play out, would have appreciated that someone finally cared enough to ask the right questions and follow where the answers led. Wolf nodded slowly. He believed in the system even when it failed him, believed that good soldiers had an obligation to make institutions better. That truth eventually found its way to light if people were brave enough to keep looking. He was right, though it took longer than either of us hoped. Maya thought about her grandfather's funeral, the flag presentation, the practiced condolences that had felt hollow even at 15 years old. When this goes public, his name gets cleared, his service record gets corrected. People will know he died protecting the truth instead of betraying his country. That matters, Colonel. That changes what his legacy means to everyone who comes after. And you, Captain, what happens to you when this breaks? You violated direct orders, compromised a classified mission, chose testimony over elimination. Some people are going to see that as insubordination, regardless of how right you were. She smiled, exhaustion making it genuine rather than political. Then some people are going to learn that integrity sometimes means disobeying orders that shouldn't have been given in the first place. My grandfather taught me that before I was old enough to understand why it mattered. Took me 20 years to fully appreciate the lesson, but I think I'm finally getting it. The congressional hearing announcement came 36 hours later, news breaking across military networks before civilian media picked it up. Emergency session of the Senate Armed Services Committee, closed-door testimony regarding classified program misconduct, unprecedented access granted to previously sealed records. The carefully worded press release didn't name Project Valkyrie, didn't mention Wolf or James Reynolds specifically, but military communities recognized the significance immediately. 20 years of rumors and speculation and whispered conspiracy theories suddenly elevated to official investigation, and the implications rippled through Pentagon corridors with the force of recognition that accountability might actually be coming. Maya watched the news coverage in Morrison's operations center, seeing retired officers being interviewed about black budget programs, veterans advocates demanding transparency, congressional representatives promising thorough investigation into military experimentation. The story was too big now to bury quietly, too many people asking questions, too much momentum behind demands for truth. Wolf stood beside her, still in the enhanced form that 2 decades of survival had made permanent, watching his transformation from classified threat to validated whistleblower play out on screens that couldn't quite believe what they were showing. Strange how fast it moves once the dam breaks. 20 years of silence, then 48 hours to become national news. Morrison entered with tablet displaying the hearing schedule. You are both testifying in 72 hours. Senate Armed Services Committee, closed session, but transcripts will be released publicly after security review. They're preparing facility accommodations for Colonel Wolf, professional protocols treating this as soldier testimony rather than asset containment. It's happening exactly the way your grandfather hoped it would. Maya felt the weight of 20 years lift, fractionally replaced by something that might eventually become peace. He'd say the work isn't done until the guilty face consequences. Testimony is step 1, accountability is step 2, systemic reform is step 3. We're just getting started. The general's smile suggested she understood exactly how long institutional change took, how many battles had to be fought before real reform took hold. Then we better pace ourselves. This is going to be a long campaign, Captain. Fortunately, soldiers know something about sustained operations. Outside the operations center, high desert stretched toward mountains that looked like broken teeth against the horizon wilderness that didn't care about human politics or military conspiracies or the weight of truth finally emerging after decades underground. Maya thought about her grandfather walking these kinds of lands during training exercises, teaching young soldiers about duty and honor and the obligation to fix institutions rather than abandon them. She thought about Wolf surviving 20 years alone, maintaining discipline when every reason existed to embrace the beast they tried to create, trusting that someday someone would care enough to ask the right questions. She thought about herself standing at the beginning of a fight that would define the rest of her career, armed with evidence and testimony, and the stubborn belief that justice delayed didn't mean justice would never come. The work wasn't finished. The conspirators hadn't faced consequences yet. The system still needed reform. But for the first time in 20 years, the truth was moving toward light, and soldiers who died trying to expose it might finally receive the vindication they'd earned. That was worth whatever came next. The Senate hearing room existed in that peculiar space where American power acknowledged its own capacity for failure. Wood-paneled walls designed to project gravitas cameras positioned to capture every angle for posterity chairs arranged in semicircular judgment that made witnesses understand exactly how exposed they were. Maya sat at the testimony table beside Wolf, both in dress uniform, though his had required custom tailoring to accommodate a frame that military supply chains had never anticipated needing to fit. Senator Catherine Walsh presided from the elevated dais, 40 years in public service, visible in the way she handled classified briefing materials without visible reaction to their contents. Colonel Wolf, Captain Reynolds, thank you for your willingness to testify before this committee. I want to state clearly for the record that this proceeding exists to establish truth, not to protect institutional reputations. If crimes were committed, we will pursue accountability regardless of rank or position. The gallery held representatives from a dozen oversight agencies, military justice specialists, intelligence community liaisons, all maintaining professional mass while processing testimony that rewrote 2 decades of accepted narrative. Wolf leaned toward the microphone, his transformed voice carrying weight that went beyond mere volume. Senator, I appreciate the opportunity to provide sworn testimony about Project Valkyrie and the subsequent conspiracy to cover up its failures. For 20 years, I've lived in exile because speaking this truth would have gotten me killed. The fact that I'm sitting in this chamber instead of buried in those woods is due entirely to Sergeant Major James Reynolds, who died protecting evidence, and his granddaughter, who finished what he started. Walsh gestured to the displays showing declassified portions of James's files. Walk us through the recruitment process. How did a decorated Special Forces officer end up volunteering for genetic experimentation? The testimony unfolded methodically, Wolf describing his SF career, the approach from Program Director Caldwell, the compelling pitch about serving country and saving American lives. He detailed the consent process, the 47 pages of legal documentation that technically disclosed risks while practically ensuring no volunteer understood what termination protocols actually meant. I signed forms authorizing medical intervention, experimental procedures, and acceptance of risk inherent to cutting-edge research. What I didn't understand until Sergeant Major Reynolds discovered the truth was that I'd also signed authorization for my own execution if I became politically inconvenient. Page 39, Section 12, Subsection D program retains authority to implement cessation protocols on any subject whose continued existence poses unacceptable security risks. Senator Rodriguez leaned forward, reading from his own copy of the consent documentation. And in plain language, what did cessation protocols mean? Murder, Senator, sanctioned assassination dressed up in bureaucratic language so the people ordering it could sleep at night. The room temperature seemed to drop, despite the heating system running steady. Walsh called for the next exhibit, financial records, showing Victor Grant's offshore accounts deposits timed precisely with key events in the conspiracy timeline. $2 million transferred 3 weeks after Wolf inherited PAC leadership. Additional payments following James Reynolds' execution, final sum paid when PAC elders officially certified that the Pharaoh Wolf posed no further threat to federal interests. Maya provided her testimony next, walking the committee through her original mission briefing, the authorization for terminal force her discovery of evidence that contradicted every aspect of the official narrative. She spoke clinically about finding her grandfather's encrypted files, about recognizing that the soldier she'd been sent to eliminate was actually a victim who'd maintained discipline through 20 years of isolation. My orders were to assess Asset Tango Whiskey and recommend either continued containment or permanent resolution. What I found was Colonel Ethan Wolfe, a decorated officer who'd been betrayed by the institution he'd served, living in a cave but maintaining military protocols because he refused to let transformation destroy his identity. The threat assessment was wrong, the intelligence was manufactured, and the mission parameters were designed to eliminate a witness rather than evaluate an asset. Senator Martinez, newer to the committee, but not to military corruption cases, fixed Maya with a look that suggested he'd built his career on asking questions others avoided. Captain Reynolds, you violated direct orders. You were authorized to use terminal force chose instead to extract evidence and provide transport for an asset your superiors considered dangerous. Why should this committee believe your judgment was sound when you directly contradicted the assessment of senior intelligence officers? Maya met his gaze without flinching. Because those senior officers were either incompetent or complicit, Senator. They sent one captain with authorization to kill a man who had survived 20 years in hostile wilderness, maintained tactical awareness despite genetic transformation, and represented the only living witness to a conspiracy that reached Pentagon leadership. If I'd followed my orders, Colonel Wolfe would be dead and the truth would have died with him. Instead, we're sitting in this hearing room with irrefutable evidence of crimes committed by people who thought they were above accountability. Martinez smiled, expression suggesting the challenge had been test rather than genuine skepticism. Thank you, Captain. I wanted your reasoning on record. Please continue. The afternoon session focused on Victor Grant's role testimony provided by PAC members who'd been systematically interviewed once Morrison's team began investigating. Elder Morrison, no relation to the general, testified about the council vote 20 years prior, about how Victor had presented forged evidence showing Wolfe planned to weaponize the PAC, about how James Reynolds had argued for delay and investigation before permanent action was taken. Victor told us that Colonel Wolfe had been compromised by foreign intelligence, that enhanced soldiers with political authority represented existential threat to PAC sovereignty. He showed us correspondence that looked legitimate, communications intercepts that seemed damning. We believed him because he'd served beside the colonel for a decade, because we couldn't imagine someone betraying their commanding officer for money. The old man's voice cracked slightly. We were wrong. We voted to exile and execute a man who'd done nothing except inherit leadership at an inconvenient time. The testimony painted Victor as methodical architect of betrayal, someone who'd understood exactly which fears to exploit, which evidence to fabricate, which loyalists to eliminate. James Reynolds had been his primary obstacle, the senior NCO whose instinct for bureaucratic corruption had led him to question injection protocols and trace them back to Pentagon black sites. Walsh called for a break at 1700 hours, gaveling the session into recess until the following morning. Maya and Wolfe were escorted to secure quarters in the Senate office building, protective detail that was half security and half insurance that key witnesses didn't disappear before testimony concluded. Wolfe stood at the window overlooking Constitution Avenue, watching evening traffic flow past monuments to democratic principles that sometimes failed in practice. Strange being back in civilization. 20 years I've been listening to forest sounds tracking prey, existing in spaces humans abandon. Now I'm in the Capitol testifying before senators about crimes committed by people who probably walk these same streets. Maya joined him at the window, seeing her reflection overlaid on the cityscape soldier in dress uniform who'd chosen truth over expedience. My grandfather used to say that institutions were only as good as the people willing to fight for them, that you couldn't expect perfection, but you could demand accountability when systems failed. I think he'd consider this progress. Progress toward what? Even if the committee recommends criminal charges, even if prosecutors indict Pentagon officials, how many will actually face consequences? How many will retire quietly with full benefits, while lawyers argue about classified authorities and national security exceptions? She couldn't argue with the cynicism, had seen enough military justice to know that accountability often meant different things depending on how many stars someone wore. Maybe not everyone pays proportionally, maybe some escape with comfortable retirements. But the truth is on record now, officially documented, impossible to bury again. Future officers will read about Project Valkyrie in ethics courses, case study, and what happens when security imperatives override moral constraints. That matters even if justice isn't perfect. The morning session opened with Deputy Secretary Caldwell's testimony. The man who'd overseen Project Valkyrie during its operational phase, now retired but still drawing pension and wielding influence through defense contractor boards. He'd been compelled to appear immunity negotiated in exchange for complete cooperation, though his lawyer sat close enough to intervene if questions approached criminal liability. Caldwell was late 60s, gray in the way powerful men went, gray suit expensive enough to signal that retirement hadn't diminished his financial security. He sat with the posture of someone accustomed to Senate chambers, answering questions with careful precision that gave information without volunteering incrimination. Deputy Secretary Caldwell, did you authorize Protocol Omega for Subject 07? I authorized termination protocols for subjects who presented unacceptable security risks, yes. That was within my authority as program director. And did Subject 07 present such a risk? Or did his inheritance of PAC leadership simply make his continued existence politically complicated? Caldwell's lawyer leaned in, whispered something. The former official nodded. The distinction you're drawing is semantic, Senator. A subject with enhanced capabilities and sovereign authority over thousands of American citizens represents a security risk by definition. Our assessment was that continued monitoring was insufficient given the potential threat to federal interests. Walsh's expression suggested she was done with semantic distinctions. Let me be clear, Mr. Caldwell. Did Colonel Wolf commit any hostile act? Did he demonstrate intent to weaponize his PAC? Did he do anything beyond inherit a leadership position that your program suddenly decided was incompatible with your experimental protocols? He disclosed Program Valkyrie to his counsel without authorization. That alone represented security breach requiring intervention. He disclosed it because he believed in transparency with people he was leading. He was trying to be ethical about participating in your experiment, and your response was to poison him with a compound designed to cause fatal organ failure. The lawyer intervened before Caldwell could respond. My client has been granted immunity for his testimony here. These questions are venturing into areas that exceed the scope of his cooperation agreement. Senator Rodriguez cut through the legal maneuvering with the bluntness that had made him effective on oversight committees. Save the immunity arguments for criminal court counselor. We're establishing facts here. Mr. Caldwell, yes or no, did you order the termination of an American soldier because he inherited a leadership position? Caldwell's pause stretched long enough that the room understood exactly what his answer would reveal. Yes. I authorized Protocol Omega because Subject 07's political elevation created unacceptable risk to program's security and federal authority over supernatural communities. The admission hung in the air like cordite after gunfire. Walsh let it settle, let cameras capture Caldwell's expression, let the record reflect that a Pentagon official had just confessed to ordering murder for political convenience. And Sergeant Major James Reynolds, did you authorize his execution as well? Reynolds discovered classified information without proper authorization. He attempted to remove sensitive materials from secure facilities. Security personnel used appropriate force when he refused to surrender evidence that could compromise national security. Maya's hand tightened on the table edge, wood grain pressing patterns into her palm. Appropriate force was the bureaucratic phrase that meant her grandfather had been shot in the back while trying to deliver proof of conspiracy to people with authority to stop it. Walsh must have seen something in Maya's expression because her next question carried edge that suggested the senator's patience with euphemism had expired. Mr. Caldwell, Sergeant Major Reynolds was unarmed according to autopsy reports. He was shot 3 times in the back at close range. Security footage from that day mysteriously malfunctioned. Does that sound like appropriate force to you, or does it sound like assassination? I was not personally present for that incident. I can only speak to the authorization given to security personnel to prevent classified information from being compromised, which is bureaucratic language for yes, you ordered his death. At least have the integrity to own what you authorized. Caldwell's lawyer stood. Senator, my client has provided testimony within the scope of his immunity agreement. Further questioning along these lines exceeds. Then we're done with your client. Walsh's gavel came down with finality. Mr. Caldwell, you're dismissed. I expect the Justice Department will be very interested in discussing the limits of your immunity agreement once they review this testimony. The afternoon brought testimony from PAC members who'd lived under Victor Grant's regime, witnesses describing systematic intimidation, loyalty tests that bordered on political purges, executions, justified as security measures, but functioning as tools of authoritarian control. The picture emerged of someone who'd used conspiracy proceeds to build personal fiefdom, transforming PAC leadership from consensual governance into military dictatorship. Master Sergeant Connor Blake testified about forced retirement, about watching good soldiers drummed out for questioning Victor's increasingly paranoid security protocols. Lieutenant Thomas Drake described growing up in a PAC that lived in fear of arbitrary punishment, where questioning authority meant disappearing into re-education programs that looked disturbingly similar to black site interrogation. My father served under Colonel Wolfe before the exile. He said those were the best years of his military career, that the colonel led through competence and integrity rather than fear. After Victor took over, my father stopped talking about the old days, said it wasn't safe to remember too loudly. He died in a border skirmish when I was 14, convenient accident that eliminated someone who might have testified about what really happened 20 years ago. Drake's testimony connected threads that showed Victor's conspiracy wasn't single act of betrayal, but sustained campaign of violence against anyone who threatened his stolen authority. 47 executions over 20 years, each justified as security necessity, each eliminating someone who'd served under Wolfe or questioned Victor's legitimacy. The senators asked detailed questions about PAC governance, supernatural community, autonomy, the balance between federal oversight and sovereign rights. Drake explained that PACs functioned as semi-sovereign entities, self-governing, but subject to constitutional law leadership transferred through inheritance or democratic selection rather than federal appointment, which makes Victor's coup particularly insidious, Senator Martinez noted. He didn't just betray his commanding officer. He overthrew legitimate governance with Pentagon backing, installed authoritarian regime, then spent 20 years eliminating anyone who remembered how things used to work. This wasn't intelligence operation. This was regime change on American soil. The third day of hearings brought Wolfe back to the testimony table, this time to address questions about his current capabilities, his potential threat level, the assessment that had originally justified containment protocols. Medical specialists from Walter Reed had examined him extensively, produced reports that tried to quantify what 2 decades of genetic transformation had done to human biology. Dr. Sarah Chen-led researcher presented findings that made clear Wolfe wasn't degrading into mindless beast as original threat assessments had predicted. Colonel Wolfe's cognitive function tests at above average human intelligence. His enhanced physical capabilities, strength, speed, sensory acuity are stable and under conscious control. The transformation appears to have reached equilibrium rather than continuing degradation. If anything, he's adapted remarkably well to circumstances that should have been psychologically catastrophic. Walsh reviewed the medical documentation with visible relief. So the original assessment that he represented uncontrolled threat was inaccurate. Profoundly inaccurate, Senator. Colonel Wolfe maintains full human cognition, demonstrates excellent impulse control, and shows no signs of the aggressive psychosis that Project Valkyrie's termination protocols were supposedly designed to prevent. In my professional opinion, he's safer than many unenhanced individuals walking around with concealed carry permits. The doctor's testimony undermined every justification for the original XA, made clear that threat assessment had been manufactured to justify elimination, rather than based on actual danger. Wolfe had been living alone in wilderness for 20 years, maintaining military discipline, harming no one, simply trying to survive circumstances others had imposed on him. Senator Rodriguez turned to Wolfe directly. Colonel, what do you want from this proceeding? What outcome would constitute justice from your perspective? Wolfe leaned toward the microphone, voice carrying the resonance that transformation had given him. I want the truth on record, Senator. I want my service record corrected. My exile declared unlawful. My court-martial overturned. I want James Reynolds posthumously exonerated, his family provided with official apology and full benefits that were denied when he was executed for trying to protect me. I want Project Valkyrie's authorization reviewed And I want recommendations that prevent future programs from treating soldiers as disposable test subjects. He paused, gathering thoughts. And I want the people who authorized my murder held accountable. Not just Caldwell, not just Victor Grant, who's conveniently dead and beyond prosecution. Everyone who signed off on Protocol Omega, everyone who approved payments to ensure my elimination, everyone who looked at evidence of conspiracy and decided classification was more important than justice. They need to face consequences, or nothing we're doing here matters beyond political theater. The committee room was silent except for ventilation systems and the soft click of court reporters capturing every word. Walsh met Wolf's eyes with expression that suggested she understood exactly how rare it was to hear someone articulate institutional accountability rather than personal vindication. Thank you, Colonel. This committee will take your testimony under advisement. We'll be making recommendations to the Justice Department, Inspector General, and Defense Secretary regarding criminal investigations, policy reforms, and corrective actions for the injustices you've described. The gavel came down and the hearing concluded with promises of accountability that Maya desperately wanted to believe would translate into actual consequences rather than polite reports buried in bureaucratic machinery. Outside the hearing room, Morrison waited with tablet displaying preliminary media coverage. The story had exploded across every major outlet Pentagon program, experimented on soldiers, murdered witnesses, covered up failures for 20 years. Retired officers were being interviewed, veterans advocates demanding reformed congressional representatives, positioning themselves as accountability champions regardless of their previous silence. You've started something that can't be stopped now, Morrison said. Justice Department has assigned Special Prosecutor Inspector General, has launched formal investigation. Defense Secretary has ordered review of all classified human research programs. The machinery is moving, and it's too visible now to quietly disappear. Maya felt exhaustion pressing against consciousness, days of testimony and hostile questioning and careful navigation of legal landmines finally catching up. How long until we know if anyone actually faces charges? Months, probably longer. Federal prosecutions move slowly, especially when targets have resources to hire elite defense attorneys. But the pressure is real. Caldwell's testimony alone gives prosecutors enough for conspiracy charges, obstruction of justice, possibly murder under federal felony statutes. Others who authorize Protocol Omega will face similar scrutiny. Wolf stood apart from the group, massive figure drawing stares from Senate staffers passing through the corridor, living proof that institutional failures had consequences beyond abstract policy discussions. Captain Reynolds and I will be returning to PAC territory. If prosecutors need additional testimony, they know how to contact us. But I've spent enough time in Washington. I'd like to go home. Home was a complicated concept for someone who'd been exiled for 20 years, who'd survived in wilderness while the world moved on, who existed now in liminal space between soldier and something else. But Morrison nodded understanding, arranged military transport back to the Pacific Northwest, and 48 hours later, Maya and Wolf stood on familiar ground as spring turned the mountains green. The PAC territory had changed during Wolf's exile, grown from small community to established settlement with infrastructure that looked almost suburban. But the welcome when they arrived was pure military. Connor Blake standing at attention with 30 veterans behind him, all in their old uniforms despite decades of forced retirement, all saluting the return of their rightful commander. Colonel Wolf, welcome home, sir. Wolf returned the salute gesture, complicated by claws and transformed physiology, but unmistakably correct in its execution. Master Sergeant Blake, good to see friendly faces. Connor's smile carried weight of 2 decades waiting for this moment. Sir, we've been maintaining readiness. Figured eventually you'd come back. Figured you'd need soldiers who remembered how things used to work. We're prepared to help rebuild what Victor destroyed. The gathering grew as word spread. Younger PAC members who'd grown up hearing stories, older veterans who'd survived Victor's purges, families who'd lost members to the conspiracy. They assembled in the Great Hall, converted airplane hangar, that served as community center, waiting to hear from the colonel who'd become legend during his exile. Wolf stood before them, military bearing maintained despite physical transformation, voice carrying across the space without artificial amplification. I left 20 years ago as your AlphaKing, betrayed by my executive officer and abandoned by institutions I'd served. I survived by maintaining discipline, by refusing to let transformation destroy my identity, by trusting that eventually truth would surface. That faith has been vindicated, but the work isn't finished. He gestured to the pack members filling the hall. Victor Grant built his regime on fear and intimidation. He executed 47 pack members over 20 years, forced good soldiers into retirement, turned leadership into dictatorship. We're going to dismantle that legacy systematically. Elder trials for anyone who collaborated with Victor's worst excesses. Exoneration for those who were wrongly accused, compensation for families who lost members to his paranoia. Connor stepped forward. Sir, we've been preparing. Lieutenant Drake has compiled records of every execution, every forced retirement, every disappearance during Victor's reign. We've identified collaborators, gathered testimony from survivors, built cases that will stand up under legal review. We're ready to begin trials whenever you give the order. The trials began a week later, formal proceedings held in the Great Hall, with Elder Morrison presiding, military justice specialists from Morrison's team observing to ensure procedures met legal standards. First case was Elder Garrett, who'd served on Victor's inner council, who'd authorized executions, including the order that sent Maya to her death in the exclusion zone. Garrett sat before the tribunal looking decades older than his years, guilt or fear having carved deep lines in his face. The charges were read methodically: complicity in wrongful executions, abuse of authority, conspiracy to suppress evidence, accessory to murder. Evidence included meeting minutes, financial records showing payments from Victor's accounts, testimony from families who'd lost members to purges. Elder Garrett, you signed execution orders for 17 PAC members over 12 years of service on Victor's council. What do you offer in your defense? The old man's voice shook. I believed Victor. He showed us intelligence reports, threat assessments, evidence of disloyalty. I thought I was protecting the PAC from infiltration and subversion. I was wrong. I authorized deaths of people who were innocent, who were simply questioning authority or remembering how things used to be. I can't undo that. I can only acknowledge that I failed in my duty to verify evidence before supporting irreversible action. The tribunal deliberated briefly, verdict unanimous. Guilty on all charges, sentence exile from PAC territory, stripped of all rank and authority, barred from holding leadership position in any supernatural community. Garrett accepted it without appeal, walking out of the Great Hall into permanent banishment with shoulders bowed under weight of his failures. Subsequent trials followed similar pattern evidence, presented defendants offered opportunity for defense verdicts rendered based on degree of complicity and willingness to acknowledge wrongdoing. Some were exiled, some were imprisoned, a few who'd acted under duress or genuine belief in fabricated intelligence received suspended sentences contingent on community service. Elder Morrison, who'd voted against Wolf's original exile, was formally exonerated and promoted to Chief Justice of the newly established judicial branch. His first official act was overturning the verdict that had condemned Wolf 20 years prior, declaring it invalid due to falsified evidence and procedural violations. Colonel Ethan Wolf, this tribunal finds that your original court-martial was based on manufactured evidence, that your exile was unlawful, and that you have been wronged by institutions that should have protected you. Your service record is corrected. Your rank restored, your authority as AlphaKing reaffirmed. This PAC owes you 2 decades of justice denied. We cannot return those years, but we can ensure that truth is recognized and that those responsible face consequences. The work of rebuilding took months: systematic dismantling of Victor's authoritarian infrastructure and replacement with governance that balanced security needs against individual rights. Wolf established oversight committees, transparency protocols, regular assemblies where PAC members could voice concerns directly to leadership. Connor was promoted to Command Sergeant Major, senior enlisted advisor who'd maintain institutional memory and ensure younger generation learned from past failures. Thomas Drake received promotion to captain, given command of border security with strict orders to operate within legal constraints, to use force only when necessary, to remember that security served the PAC rather than controlling it. Derek Hayes, who'd risen through Victor's regime but testified honestly during trials, was given second chance as training officer with responsibility for teaching ethics alongside tactics. Maya maintained her active duty status, officially designated as military liaison between PAC communities and federal government role that gave her authority to prevent future conspiracies while keeping her embedded in the institution her grandfather had died serving. She split time between PAC territory and Pentagon assignments, building relationships with officials who survived the Valkyrie scandal and were genuinely committed to reform. 6 months after the hearings concluded, Special Prosecutor Williams announced indictments. Caldwell charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, violation of federal civil rights statutes. 3 other former Pentagon officials faced similar charges, cases built on testimony and evidence that James Reynolds had died protecting. The trials would take years, appeals would drag on longer, but accountability was finally moving through official channels rather than remaining buried in classified archives. Morrison's oversight team recommended systemic reforms, mandatory review of all classified human research programs, enhanced protections for military whistleblowers, congressional approval requirements for any project involving genetic experimentation, independent ethics boards with authority to terminate programs that violated consent standards. Some recommendations became law, others remained contentious proposals, but the conversation had shifted in ways that made future Valkyrie programs politically impossible. Maya stood with Wolf on the boundary stones where she'd first entered the exclusion zone a year earlier, watching sunset paint the mountains golden red. The zone designation had been officially lifted, recognized as a legal containment rather than legitimate security measure. Hikers could now traverse the wilderness freely, though most gave the area wide berth after stories emerged about what had happened there. Connor asked what comes next. Whether you're planning to remain active in PAC leadership or eventually step back once rebuilding is complete. Wolf considered the question. Massive frame relaxed in ways he hadn't been during Washington testimony or the trials that followed. I spent 20 years surviving, maintaining discipline because it gave me purpose, refusing to surrender humanity because that felt like letting them win. Now I have opportunity to actually lead instead of simply existing. Would be waste not to use it. He turned to face her. What about you, Captain? Pentagon liaison is important work, but it's also keeping you away from territory more than you're here. Connor and Thomas can handle daily operations. Question is whether military career still serves what you need or whether finishing your grandfather's mission has changed what you want from service. Maya had been asking herself similar questions, trying to determine whether wearing uniform represented continuation of James Reynolds' legacy or simply inertia carrying her forward in paths others had chosen. He believed in institutions, believed that good soldiers made systems better through service rather than abandoning them when they failed. I think he'd want me to stay in, to keep pushing for reform from inside, to make sure his death led to actual change rather than just temporary accountability. But part of me wonders if I've done what he needed me to do. Exposed the conspiracy, provided testimony, started accountability machinery moving. Maybe the next phase belongs to other. Maybe I've earned the right to choose what comes next based on what I want rather than what duty demands. Wolf nodded slowly, understanding, visible in eyes that had adapted to see in darkness. James also believed that soldiers needed to know when their mission was complete, when holding positions stopped being strategic and became martyrdom. He'd want you to serve with purpose, not out of obligation to his memory. Whatever you decide, you have already honored his sacrifice more than he could have hoped. The choice crystallized over following weeks. Resignation letter drafted and redrafted a dozen times before Maya finally submitted it to her chain of command. Not abandonment of service, but recognition that her mission had shifted, that rebuilding PAC governance and preventing future conspiracies didn't require active duty status. She could serve as civilian consultant, maintain security clearances, provide expertise without wearing uniform that carried weight of institutional loyalty. Her commander accepted the resignation with understanding that suggested he'd been expecting it. You've done exceptional work, Captain Reynolds. The military is losing a talented officer, but sometimes the best service happens outside official channels. If you need recommendations or security consultations, my door remains open. The promotion ceremony happened simultaneously with her retirement, Maya leaving service as major rather than captain, recognition of her contributions, and acknowledgement that rank sometimes mattered for credibility in civilian roles. She wore the uniform one final time at the ceremony, accepted the oak leaf clusters with gratitude, then changed into civilian clothes that felt simultaneously foreign and liberating. Connor's retirement party, His actual retirement, this time not forced exile, drew 200 pack members, combination of military ceremony and pack celebration. The old sergeant had rebuilt security infrastructure, trained new generation of warriors, ensured that institutional memory survived Victor's attempt to erase it. His final act was establishing archive documenting the conspiracy, evidence preserved so future generations would understand exactly what had happened and why vigilance mattered. 40 years I've been a soldier, Connor said, voice carrying across the gathered pack. Served under 3 Alpha Kings, watched institutions fail and recover. Learned that discipline serves people rather than power. My last lesson for you youngsters, remember that authority requires accountability. The moment leaders stop answering for their decisions is the moment you stop having legitimate governance and start having tyranny. Thomas Drake stood at attention throughout the speech, young officer who'd grown from Victor's regime soldier into someone who understood that following orders meant exercising moral judgment rather than abandoning it. His command of border security emphasized de-escalation over confrontation, community protection over territorial aggression, everything Victor's paranoid protocols hadn't been. The final piece fell into place when Justice Department announced plea agreements. Caldwell pled guilty to conspiracy and obstruction charges, received 15 years federal prison in exchange for testimony against co-conspirators. 2 other officials accepted similar deals, avoiding murder charges by cooperating fully with prosecutions. The 4th defendant went to trial, was convicted on all counts, received 25 years. That would likely mean dying in prison, given his age. Maya watched the verdict from pack territory, live stream proceedings on laptop, Wolf standing behind her chair, following developments that represented something approaching closure. Not perfect justice, not everyone pays proportionally, but accountability happened, officially recognized, documented, for anyone who wants to understand how institutions can fail and how they can correct course. Wolf's reflection in the laptop screen showed expression that might have been satisfaction or might simply have been exhaustion at carrying weight of vindication after so long expecting none. James would say it's progress, would acknowledge that systemic reform takes generations, that exposing one conspiracy doesn't prevent future failures. But he'd also say that soldiers do their duty, accept that outcomes aren't always perfect, and trust that their actions contribute to incremental improvement. The memorial dedication happened on the anniversary of James Reynolds' death, granite monument erected in Pac Territories Central Plaza. Inscription, simple and direct, Sergeant Major James Reynolds, United States Army. Died protecting truth from those who valued convenience over justice. His sacrifice ensured that crimes committed in darkness would eventually face light. Maya's grandmother traveled across country for the ceremony, touching the stone with fingers that shook slightly. He'd be proud of you, Maya, finishing what he started, refusing to let his death become another classified casualty. Thank you for giving him back his honor. Wolf stood beside the monument in dress uniform, specially tailored for his transformed frame medals, spanning 30-plus years of service, including Silver Star that had been restored along with his rank. Sergeant Major Reynolds served under my command for 5 years. Best NCO I ever worked with, understood that leadership meant protecting soldiers even when that protection came at personal cost. He died because he believed truth mattered more than his own safety. We're here because he was right. The ceremony concluded with 21-gun salute flag presentation to James's widow and gathering where PAC members who'd never met the sergeant major heard stories about the soldier who'd refused to let conspiracy succeed. Connor spoke about James's tactical brilliance. Thomas described how his father had revered the old NCO's integrity. Morrison detailed how James had tried to present evidence that day 24 years ago before Victor's men murdered him. Maya stood at the memorial as sun set and PAC members gradually departed, leaving her alone with granite that represented more than one man's sacrifice. This was monument to every soldier who'd chosen duty over expediency, who'd refused to let institutional failures go unchallenged, who'd paid ultimate price, trusting that eventually someone would care enough to finish their mission. I completed what you started, Grandpa. Exposed the conspiracy, provided testimony, started accountability moving. They're rebuilding governance the way you believed it should work, transparent, answerable, serving people, rather than controlling them. It took 24 years, but justice finally caught up to the people who murdered you. She felt Wolf's presence before he spoke, enhanced soldier moving silently despite his size. He'd be proud, Maya. not just of what you accomplished, but of how you did it. Could have pursued revenge, could have used evidence to destroy everyone remotely connected to Valkyrie. Instead, you chose accountability through proper channels, justice over vengeance, exactly what James would have wanted. Doesn't bring him back. Doesn't give my grandmother the decades they should have had together. No, but it ensures his death meant something beyond tragedy. Changes the story from soldier murdered by conspiracy to soldier whose sacrifice exposed institutional corruption and forced reform. That's better legacy than most of us get. They stood together watching stars emerge as darkness deepened, two people who'd been shaped by James Reynolds' choices, who'd finished the mission he'd started, who understood that justice delayed wasn't justice denied if someone cared enough to keep pursuing truth regardless of obstacles. The packed territory thrived in ways it hadn't during Victor's regime: population growing, economy strengthening, reputation improving among neighboring supernatural communities. Wolf led with competence that 2 decades of survival had refined, making decisions that balanced security needs against individual freedom, never forgetting that authority required accountability or it devolved into oppression. Maya worked as civilian consultant, maintaining security clearances, advising military programs on ethics and oversight, ensuring that lessons from Valkyrie shaped future policy rather than being forgotten once media attention moved on. She split time between packed territory and federal assignments, building career that honored her grandfather's belief that soldiers served institutions while holding them accountable. Connor enjoyed actual retirement, training new warriors, but no longer carrying operational responsibility, watching younger generation implement reforms he'd helped design. Thomas commanded with integrity that would have made his father proud. Derek taught ethics alongside tactics. Morrison administered justice with wisdom that had survived Victor's attempts to corrupt it. The system wasn't perfect. Some conspirators escaped prosecution. Some reforms remained incomplete. Some officials opposed changes that constrained their authority. But progress had been made, truth documented, accountability established in ways that created foundation for continued improvement. And in a storage vault at Fort Lewis, a box 347 sat empty, its contents finally delivered to the people who needed them. Mission completed after quarter-century of waiting. Somewhere James Reynolds would approve of that efficiency, appreciate that bureaucracy occasionally served justice instead of obscuring it. Understand that his granddaughter had honored his sacrifice by refusing to let convenient lies triumph over inconvenient truth. The work continued as it always did, because institutions required constant maintenance, and vigilance came at the cost of eternal awareness. But for the first time in 24 years, the work moved forward with foundation of truth rather than structure built on classified failures and murdered witnesses. That was progress, James Reynolds would say. That was what soldiers fought for. Not perfect justice, but incremental improvement systems that learned from failures rather than repeating them, institutions that answered to principles rather than expedience. And his granddaughter, standing beside a memorial that bore his name, understood exactly what he'd meant. 3 years folded into the landscape like sediment, settling after upheaval, packed territory, transforming from Victor's militarized compound into something resembling actual community. The changes were visible in details that mattered: children playing without checking over shoulders, elders gathering without fear of surveillance, warriors patrolling borders with protocols emphasizing protection rather than intimidation. Wolf stood in the operations center, reviewing morning reports, Connor beside him, despite official retirement, because some habits were too useful to abandon. Border security logged routine overnight, 3 false alarms from wildlife triggers, 1 legitimate concern about human hikers straying close to sensitive areas, but turning back when trail markers redirected them. Nothing requiring command intervention. Quiet night makes me nervous when it's this quiet. Connor's laugh held the rough edges of someone who'd seen enough action to distrust peace. You've been reading threat assessments too long, Colonel. Sometimes quiet just means we've built decent systems and people are following them. Not everything has to be prelude to catastrophe. The radio crackled before Wolf could respond, Thomas Drake's voice carrying controlled urgency that immediately sharpened attention. Command, this is Border Actual. We've got situation developing at Checkpoint Delta. 3 vehicles approaching from the south, no advance notification, moving with tactical spacing. Request authorization to establish hard stop. Wolf keyed the transmit. Border actual, what's their apparent intent? Civilian lost tourists or something more concerning? Vehicles are black SUVs with federal plates, tinted windows, moving like they know exactly where they're headed. This isn't lost tourists, sir. This looks like official business that didn't bother with courtesy notifications. Connor moved to the tactical display, pulling up Checkpoint Delta's camera feeds. The approaching vehicles were indeed Federal General Services Administration plates, the kind used by agencies that preferred not advertising which specific branch of government they represented. Could be routine inspection, could be new administration wanting to establish oversight. Presence could be something we won't like very much. Wolf made the calculation that leadership always required preparation for threat versus overreaction that created incidents. Border actual established soft stop. Professional courtesy, request identification and purpose of visit, but don't escalate unless they force the issue. I'm en route to your position. The drive to Checkpoint Delta took 20 minutes through mountain roads that Wolf knew by memory after 3 years of rebuilding. Maya sat beside him, drawn from her consulting work by the same instinct that had made her effective intelligence officer. Federal agencies didn't make unannounced visits to sovereign territory unless they had reasons they didn't want discussed in advance. The checkpoint was professional operation when they arrived, Thomas maintaining perimeter control, while the 3 SUVs sat in neat line waiting for clearance. The lead vehicle's door opened as Wolf's command truck stopped, figure emerging in standard federal agent uniform. Dark suit, tactical bearing expression, suggesting this wasn't social call. Agent Sarah Martinez, according to credentials she offered for inspection. FBI Domestic Terrorism Division carrying authorization from assistant director level. Colonel Wolf, I apologize for the unannounced arrival. Circumstances required expedited response before formal diplomatic channels could be arranged. Wolf examined the credentials, verified the authorization codes against database that Maya maintained for exactly these situations. Everything checked legitimate, which somehow made the visit more concerning rather than less. Agent Martinez, you're welcome to state your business. But expedited response usually means someone's expecting resistance, and that makes me wonder what you think I'm about to resist. Martinez gestured to the other vehicles. I have intelligence analysts and tactical specialists who need to brief you on developing threat. Can we proceed to your operations center, or would you prefer initial briefing here? The tactical calculations shifted. Bringing federal agents into command center meant accepting their presence deep inside territory, but refusing suggested defensive posture that might be unwarranted. Maya caught his eye, nodded fractionally, reading the same variables and reaching same conclusion. Follow us to operations. But Agent Martinez, understand that sovereign territory means my security protocols apply. Your people will be escorted, monitored, and removed immediately if I determine their presence threatens PAC safety. The operations center felt smaller, with 7 additional people occupying it, FBI personnel setting up portable briefing equipment, while Connor's security team maintained watchful positions. Martinez took point on the presentation tactical displays showing satellite imagery of desert terrains somewhere in the American Southwest. 3 weeks ago, we identified organized activity at this location, abandoned military testing range in New Mexico, officially decommissioned since the 90s. Intelligence indicates someone is attempting to replicate Project Valkyrie using stolen research data and recruited test subjects. We're calling it Valkyrie 2.0, and early assessments suggest whoever's running it learned from their original program's mistakes. The imagery cycled through enhanced views showing underground construction, vehicle movements, suggesting supply deliveries, thermal signatures indicating extensive power consumption. Someone had invested serious resources into building facility that looked disturbingly similar to descriptions from Valkyrie documentation. Wolf studied the images with sinking recognition. Who's running it? If this is sanctioned federal program, you wouldn't need my involvement. So either this is rogue operation, or you're here because you need capabilities your agency doesn't officially possess. Martinez's expression confirmed both suspicions. Initial investigations suggest private funding, possibly international backing, definitely employing personnel with classified backgrounds. We've identified at least 2 former Valkyrie researchers, 3 military contractors who specialize in genetic modification and security team that includes operators with special forces experience. She pulled up personnel files, faces Wolf recognized from his own Valkyrie participation lab, technicians, program managers, the kind of people who understood experimental protocols because they had administered them to soldiers who trusted government promises. They're recruiting test subjects from vulnerable populations, veterans with service-connected disabilities, promising enhanced healing and restored function. Homeless military personnel, people desperate enough to accept risks if it means escaping their current situations. Maya leaned forward, military intelligence training, recognizing patterns. How many subjects are we talking about? And what's their injection protocol? Are they using Valkyrie's original compounds or something modified? We estimate 12 to 15 active subjects based on supply chain analysis. As for the compounds, that's where it gets complicated. They appear to be using modified formulas designed to avoid the psychological fractures that characterized original program. Early results suggest their subjects maintain better cognitive stability, but with reduced physical enhancements. They're trying to create controllable super soldiers rather than powerful but unstable assets. The implications crystallize with uncomfortable clarity. Someone had studied Valkyrie's failures, concluded that Wolf's transformation represented unacceptable risk, and was attempting to produce enhanced soldiers who could be reliably commanded. Military assets without the inconvenient independence that had made Pentagon nervous about Wolf's pack leadership. Connor spoke what everyone was thinking. So they're building private army of enhanced soldiers with modified protocols that emphasize control over capability. And you're here because FBI can't raid the facility without sparking constitutional crisis over federal authority, but Sovereign PAC could theoretically intervene if we had compelling interest in preventing unauthorized genetic experimentation. Martinez's silence was confirmation. The FBI needed plausible deniability legal cover for intervention that couldn't be officially sanctioned, and Wolf represented both capability and motivation to shut down a program that threatened everything his own transformation had cost. What do you need from us, Agent Martinez? Be specific, because I'm not committing PAC resources to federal operation without understanding exactly what you're asking and what authority backs it. The agent pulled out tablet, called up operational proposal that had clearly been drafted before this meeting. We need enhanced reconnaissance to determine facility capability, rescue operation for test subjects who may be held against will, and tactical intervention to prevent program from reaching operational phase. FBI provides intelligence, logistics, legal cover. Your PAC provides capabilities we can't officially deploy. Wolf read through the proposal methodically, seeing competent planning overlaid with desperation that came from agency, knowing they had legitimate threat but insufficient authority to address it directly. You want me to conduct military operation on American soil against American citizens using enhanced capabilities that technically shouldn't exist because your agency lacks legal authority to act preemptively against genetic experimentation that isn't explicitly illegal until someone gets hurt. Yes, that's exactly what we need. And before you refuse on principle, understand that test subjects in that facility include 17-year-old homeless veteran who was recruited with promises of healing his combat injuries. They're experimenting on kids, Colonel. Veterans who served their country and are now being used as lab rats because someone decided Valkyrie's failure was opportunity for improvement rather than warning about playing God with human genetics. The operational planning took 3 days, Maya coordinating with FBI intelligence, while Wolf assembled tactical team from PAC's most experienced operators. Thomas would command direct action. Element, Connor would run logistics despite retirement. Derek would handle extraction coordination. 12 total operators, enhanced capabilities balanced against need for precision rather than overwhelming force. The briefings were exhaustive facility layouts derived from construction records and satellite imagery, security assessment suggesting 20 armed guards with military experience, subject locations based on thermal analysis and supply delivery patterns. Entry points identified egress routes, planned contingencies developed for scenarios ranging from unopposed rescue to sustained combat against prepared defenders. Maya watched the planning sessions with mixture of professional appreciation and personal concern, seeing Wolf shift into operational commander mode that 3 years of civilian governance hadn't eroded. You're thinking about what happened in those woods 20 years ago. Whether the test subjects in New Mexico are like you, Volunteers who didn't understand what they were signing, people who deserve rescue rather than judgment. Wolf nodded slowly. I was 31 when I volunteered for Valkyrie. Thought I was serving my country, pushing human limits for noble purpose. Took me years to understand I'd been experimental asset from the beginning, that informed consent meant nothing when information was deliberately obscured. If there are subjects in that facility who made similar mistakes, they deserve extraction before they become what I became. Thomas entered carrying weapons inventory, professional focus, overriding any uncertainty about operations' legal ambiguity. Sir were equipped for surgical intervention, non-lethal options for subjects in lower-level security, lethal authorization for anyone who presents imminent threat. Rules of engagement drafted to minimize casualties while ensuring mission success. The tactical approach emphasized speed and surprise insertion via helicopter 20 miles from facility ground movement during darkness breach, coordinated with FBI's simultaneous engagement of facility leadership who were traveling for supply meeting. Split the defense overwhelm, remaining security before they could organize resistance, extract subjects, before anyone understood what was happening. They rehearsed for 48 hours using mock-up facility built from intelligence data, drilling entry sequences until they flowed with mechanical precision. Enhanced operators moving through structures designed for human scale, adapting techniques to capabilities that let them cover ground faster and hit harder than standard military forces. The night of execution was moonless desert darkness, absolute beyond artificial light. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, drop zone, exactly where maps promised, team assembling and moving toward objective with practiced efficiency. Wolf led from front, enhanced senses reading terrain. Connor's voice providing updates through encrypted communications about FBI's progress engaging facility leadership. 2 miles from facility, Thomas signaled halt. Thermal imaging showed security patrol pattern had changed, guards concentrated near main entrance rather than distributed across perimeter. Either they detected approach or someone had updated security protocols. Either way, the plan required adjustment. Wolf keyed his radio. All elements security posture has changed. Looks like someone's nervous about something. We proceed but assume they're expecting visitors. Connor confirmed FBI has facility leadership engaged. Connor's response came through with clarity that suggested the operations communications were working despite distance. FBI confirms leadership convoy is stopped for enforcement action. Facility should be isolated from external command, but on-site security may have standing orders for unexpected situations. The breach happened, fast-shaped charges on side entrance, simultaneous assault through 3 access points, enhanced operators moving through facility faster than defending security could coordinate response. The guards were competent but unprepared for attackers who moved with supernatural speed and strength, non-lethal takedowns executed with precision that came from extensive training. Thomas's team secured the subject containment area, finding 12 individuals in various stages of transformation, some showing obvious physical changes, others appearing mostly human, but with heightened vitality, suggesting successful genetic integration. All were restrained medical monitors tracking vital signs, observation equipment, recording data that would have been familiar to anyone who'd participated in original Valkyrie program. The youngest was indeed 17, according to facility records, Marine Corps veteran, despite age recruited after medical discharge for injuries sustained in training accident. He looked at the assault team with confusion that shifted to hope when Thomas cut his restraints. Who are you? Are you rescuing us or just different people running more experiments? We're getting you out. Can you walk? The teenager tested his legs, stumbled slightly, but maintained balance with enhanced coordination that suggested whatever they had injected was working at least partially as intended. Yeah, I can move. What about the others? Some of them aren't as far along in the process, they might need medical support. Thomas assigned operators to assist subjects who couldn't move independently, evacuation proceeding according to rehearsed procedures, while Wolf's element pushed deeper into facility, searching for research data and program leadership. The laboratory section held equipment that looked disturbingly advanced compared to Valkyrie's 90s-era technology, gene sequencing machines. Bioreactors, neural interface stations, suggesting they were attempting integration beyond simple physical enhancement. Maya moved through the lab with methodical efficiency, downloading data from every accessible system, photographing documentation, securing physical samples that FBI would need for prosecution. This is more sophisticated than Valkyrie. They're not just creating enhanced soldiers, they're trying to establish direct neural control. These interface stations are designed to override subject autonomy, turn enhanced individuals into remotely commanded assets. The implication was horrifying in ways that went beyond physical transformation. Valkyrie had damaged subjects through genetic modification, but left their minds mostly intact. This program wanted to create enhanced soldiers with implanted obedience, removing the inconvenient independence that had made Wolf problematic for Pentagon planners. Wolf examined the interface documentation military training, recognizing tactical applications immediately. Remote-controlled super soldiers. Every authoritarian's dream, enhanced capabilities without risk of insubordination. They could deploy these assets for operations that regular military couldn't conduct, maintain plausible deniability because the soldiers wouldn't even remember what they'd done afterward. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted analysis facility leadership returning despite FBI's supposed engagement, multiple SUVs moving fast toward the compound. Either the FBI operation had failed or someone had warned the program directors that their facility was being raided. Connor's voice crackled urgency through the radio. Command, we've got company inbound. 3 vehicles moving, tactical estimate arrival in 2 minutes. FBI reports their enforcement action was compromised. Leadership convoy split. At last moment, decoy vehicle was stopped, but primary targets are returning to facility. Wolf made instantaneous calculation. All elements expedite extraction. Subjects and data take priority over complete site exploitation. Thomas, get your people to the exfil point. Maya, finish downloading and prepare to move. We're not staying to defend this position. The evacuation became running retreat as first vehicle reached the compound. Armed personnel deploying with professional efficiency that suggested these weren't simple security contractors. Enhanced operators carried subjects who couldn't move quickly. Thomas's team providing covering fire that was carefully aimed above heads, rather than center mass mission, was rescue, not creating bodies that would complicate legal aftermath. Maya ran beside Wolf, carrying encrypted drives containing facility data, laboratory samples secured in tactical pack. Behind them, the facility erupted in sustained gunfire, security team laying down suppressive fire that kept them moving but didn't manage effective hits. The enhanced operators could move faster than human adversaries expected, covering ground with speed that created separation even under hostile fire. The helicopter waited at designated extraction point, rotors already turning crew chief, providing covering fire, while the assault team loaded subjects and equipment. Thomas conducted count 12 subjects, 14 operators, Maya with data packages, everyone present and accounted for despite hostile pursuit that was now visible as flashlights bobbing through desert darkness. Everyone's loaded, go, go, go. The helicopter lifted with bullets impacting the fuselage armor, holding against small arms fire altitude, increasing faster than ground-based shooters could adjust their aim. Within 30 seconds, they were beyond effective range facility, dwindling behind them, mission complete, despite the compromised approach and hasty extraction. The teenage Marine sat near the cargo door, watching the desert scroll past expression, cycling through confusion and relief and dawning understanding. You're Colonel Wolf. I saw congressional testimony read about Project Valkyrie. They told us you were propaganda, that the government made up stories about failed programs to justify oversight that hampered innovation. They said their research would succeed where Valkyrie failed because they'd learned from past mistakes. Wolf settled beside him, massive frame, making the helicopter's military seating look inadequate. What's your name, Marine? Private First Class Daniel Morrison, sir. Served 8 months before training. Quaden left me with compressed spine, chronic pain. Medical discharge. They approached me at VA hospital and said they could heal my injuries, make me stronger, give me chance to serve again. Seemed like answer to prayers. And now, Morrison gestured to his hands, which showed subtle changes, nails that looked more like claws, muscle definition, that went beyond human normal reflexes that had caught the cargo webbing when turbulence hit before his conscious mind registered movement. Now I don't know what I am. They injected me with compounds that changed fundamental biology, implanted neural interface that they said would help with integration, but felt like someone else driving my body. And according to your testimony, similar program tried to kill you when you became inconvenient. So I guess I'm enhanced soldier with unknown life expectancy and probably complications that won't emerge for years. Maya moved to join the conversation intelligence officer reading the fear underneath Morrison's controlled military bearing. What Colonel Wolf became through Valkyrie is sitting right next to you, Daniel. Enhanced capabilities, yes. Transformed beyond standard human parameters, definitely. But still himself after 20-something years, still in control, still capable of making choices based on who he is rather than what was done to him. The enhancements don't have to define you unless you let them. The flight to PAC territory took 3 hours, subjects receiving medical attention from operators with battlefield medicine training, vital signs, monitored complications addressed as they emerged. 2 subjects showed signs of rejection, bodies fighting the genetic modifications, immune systems treating enhancements as invasive pathogens. They received stabilizing medications that Maya had prepared based on Valkyrie documentation enough to keep them alive until proper medical facilities could provide comprehensive treatment. The landing at PAC territory came with prepared facilities, medical center established specifically for this operation, staff trained in protocols derived from Wolf's own treatment over the years, equipment capable of monitoring enhanced biology that standard hospitals couldn't properly assess. FBI medical personnel waited alongside PAC doctors, jurisdictional questions deferred in favor of immediate patient care. Martinez met them on the landing pad, expression mixing relief at successful extraction with concern about operational complications. Good work getting them out. Less good work leaving bodies behind at the facility. 3 security personnel killed during your egress, all American citizens, none with warrants or criminal records that would justify lethal force. Wolf's jaw tightened. My operators were authorized lethal force for imminent threats. If security personnel died, it's because they chose to engage enhanced soldiers with lethal weapons. We didn't go there to kill anyone. We went to rescue test subjects from illegal experimentation. I understand that. Judge might understand that. But prosecutors are going to have questions about sovereign PAC conducting military operations on U.S. soil, and defense attorneys are going to argue that enhanced operators represent disproportionate force regardless of initial intent. This gets legally complicated fast, Colonel. The debriefing lasted through the night, FBI collecting testimony from every operator, documenting decision points and rules of engagement, building case file that would either justify the intervention or hang everyone involved. Maya provided downloaded data laboratory samples documentation showing neural interface testing and involuntary subject retention. The evidence painted a picture of programming that had gone beyond research into human rights violations, but question remained whether that justified the extraction method. Morrison and other subjects gave statements describing recruitment, promises, initial consent that didn't mention neural interfaces or irreversible modifications, realization that they'd become experimental assets rather than enhanced soldiers with choice about their futures. The youngest subject's testimony was particularly damning, 17 years old, technically unable to provide legal consent for medical procedures recruited through deception and retained through armed security. Martinez compiled everything into a preliminary report that disappeared into FBI bureaucracy while PAC territory waited for federal response that could range from commendation to criminal charges. Wolf continued normal operations, refusing to let operational uncertainty disrupt governance, trusting that evidence would speak clearly enough to overcome legal complications. The call came a week later, Assistant Director Mitchell requesting secure video conference. His expression on screen suggested bureaucrat who'd spent days in legal consultations and political briefings. Colonel Wolf, I've reviewed operational reports, subject testimony, and facility evidence. I'm prepared to offer assessment from FBI perspective. I'm listening. Mitchell pulled up documentation visible on shared screen. The facility you raided was conducting illegal human experimentation without proper oversight, informed consent, or safety protocols. Subject retention was involuntary security, exceeded legitimate protection of research and neural interface testing, violated federal guidelines on cognitive autonomy. Based on recovered evidence, Justice Department is preparing the charges against facility operators, financial backers, and research personnel. He paused, legal precision giving way to something closer to grudging respect. Your intervention prevented ongoing crimes against vulnerable populations. The 3 security deaths will be reviewed, but preliminary assessment suggests your operators acted within reasonable self-defense parameters given the circumstances. FBI is recommending no federal prosecution of PAC personnel involved in the extraction. Wolf felt tension he'd been carrying dissolve fractionally. What about the subjects they're enhanced now changed in ways that can't be reversed? What's their status under federal law, citizens with unusual capabilities, or experimental assets subject to government oversight? That's more complicated. Legally, they're citizens who were victimized by criminal enterprise. Practically, they're individuals with capabilities that make certain agencies nervous. Recommendation is that they receive medical monitoring, psychological support, and legal recognition as victims rather than threats. But Colonel understand that enhanced individuals outside military chain of command make people uncomfortable. There will be pressure for registration monitoring control measures. Maya leaned into camera view, which is exactly the kind of overreach that created Project Valkyrie in the first place. Enhanced citizens deserve same constitutional protections as everyone else. If federal agencies want oversight, they need to build trust rather than imposing surveillance. Mitchell's expression suggested he agreed personally but faced institutional pressure. I'll relay your position. For now, FBI considers the operation closed successfully. The subjects are free to remain in your territory or relocate as they choose, with understanding that PAC will provide initial support for their transition. The 12 subjects integrated into PAC territory with varying degrees of success. Morrison proved natural fit Marine Corps discipline, translating well to PAC's military structure, enhanced capabilities making him effective in border security, where strength and speed provided tactical advantages. He trained under Thomas, learned to control transformation rather than fight it, found purpose in protecting community that had rescued him. 3 others chose to stay permanently, finding acceptance among people who understood what it meant to exist outside standard human parameters. The remaining 8 eventually relocated after medical stabilization and psychological counseling, seeking to rebuild civilian lives away from reminders of their exploitation. PAC provided financial support, legal assistance, ongoing medical monitoring as they scattered across the country. Dr. Chen from Walter Reed established formal research partnership studying long-term effects of enhancement protocols with focus on medical care rather than military application. Her team treated PAC members as patients rather than experimental subjects, revolutionary approach that earned trust where Pentagon programs had generated suspicion. The data collected would inform treatment protocols for enhanced individuals while respecting their autonomy and rights. The congressional hearing on Valkyrie 2.0 happened 6 months after the raid closed session, reviewing FBI operation and PAC involvement. Wolf testified again this time about rescue rather than personal victimization, explaining tactical decisions and rules of engagement. Martinez presented evidence of facility crimes, making clear that intervention had prevented ongoing human rights violations. Senator Walsh, still chairing Armed Services Committee, reviewed operational reports with expression, suggesting she'd seen this pattern before. Colonel Wolf, we seem to be developing habit where you end up conducting military operations because federal agencies lack authority or capability to address enhanced human threats. That's not sustainable long-term, and it creates concerning precedent about sovereign PACs functioning as private military forces. Wolf met her gaze directly. Senator, I agree completely, which is why I'm proposing formal framework PAC capabilities available for operations that serve public interest conducted under legal oversight with clear authorization and accountability. We're not private military. We're enhanced Americans willing to serve when circumstances require capabilities that regular forces can't provide. Now, the proposal evolved over subsequent months into what became Enhanced Response Protocols Framework, allowing federal agencies to request PAC assistance for operations involving supernatural threats or enhanced individuals subject to judicial review and congressional notification. Not perfect solution, but formal structure that prevented both unauthorized operations and failure to act when legitimate threats emerged. Maya drafted much of the protocol language, drawing on military experience and legal education that Washington consulting work had encouraged her to pursue. The final document balanced PAC sovereignty against federal interests, individual rights against security needs, creating framework that neither side loved but both could accept. 3 years after Valkyrie 2.0's shutdown, Wolf stood in the Operations Center reviewing morning reports that now included federal request queue agencies submitting formal proposals for PAC assistance, each reviewed for legal merit and operational necessity before approval. Most requests were declined situations that regular law enforcement could handle perfectly well, but occasional missions required enhanced capabilities that only PAC could provide. Connor's retirement had finally stuck this time-old Sergeant Major content to teach tactics and tell stories to younger generation. Thomas commanded all tactical operations, now promoted to Major, overseeing border security and response teams with competence that made Wolf confident about succession planning. Derek ran training programs that emphasized ethics alongside tactics, ensuring new operators understood that enhancement required responsibility rather than enabling recklessness. Morrison had become something of PAC's celebrity youngest member of response teams, Marine Corps discipline combined with natural talent, making him exceptional operator. He had testified before Congress about his Valkyrie 2.0 experience, face of enhanced veterans arguing for recognition rather than registration rights, rather than restrictions. Maya split time between PAC territory and Washington consulting relationship with Wolf evolved into professional partnership that occasionally acknowledged deeper connection, but never let it interfere with governance. They'd learned that leading it meant maintaining clear boundaries, that effectiveness required separating personal feelings from operational decisions, that the work mattered more than individual needs. The memorial to James Reynolds had become gathering place for PAC members, granite monument, where people came to reflect on sacrifice and service. Maya visited regularly, updating her grandfather on developments he'd never witnessed, but had made possible through his courage 24 years earlier. They're rebuilding governance the right way, Grandpa. Transparent, accountable, serving people rather than controlling them. Enhanced response protocols mean PAC can help without becoming private army. Subjects from New Mexico are thriving, most of them anyway. We're making progress on the things you died trying to achieve. She felt Wolf's presence, enhanced soldier moving quietly despite size that should have made stealth impossible. He'd be proud, Maya. Not just of what we've accomplished, but of how we did it. Could have pursued revenge after the hearings destroyed everyone connected to Valkyrie. Instead, we built systems to prevent future failures, created frameworks for accountability, chose reform over retribution. Sometimes I wonder if it's enough. Caldwell got 15 years, but he'll probably serve less than 10. Other conspirators made deals, avoided worse consequences. Victor's dead, so he never faced justice. Not exactly proportional accountability for 47 murders and 20 years of your exile. Wolf settled beside the memorial massive frame, relaxed in ways he'd never managed during testimony or tactical operations. James believed that institutional change mattered more than individual punishment, that you couldn't build better systems through vengeance, only through methodical reform and sustained commitment to improvement. We've done that, created oversight, established protocols, ensured future Valkyries face scrutiny before they victimize soldiers. The PAC territory spread below them, community thriving in ways Victor's regime had never permitted, children growing up without fear, families building lives with confidence that authority answered to principles rather than paranoia. 24 years from James Reynolds' murder to this moment of relative peace, justice delayed but ultimately realized through persistent work. Morrison approached carrying reports for review, young Marine turned enhanced operator, fulfilling role that honored his service while using capabilities that criminal program had inadvertently provided. Sir, we've got federal requests for consultation, Fish and Wildlife needs assessment of enhanced predator reports in Montana. Probably just normal wildlife, but they want expert evaluation before declaring the threat. Wolf took the report, scanned it briefly, made the calculation that leadership required. Standard reconnaissance, minimal force authorization, coordinate with local PAC for territorial courtesy. Take 2 operators, be back in 72 hours with assessment. Morrison saluted, professional gesture that acknowledged chain of command while maintaining military respect. Yes, sir, we'll handle it. The Operations Center continued its work, monitoring borders and processing requests, managing relationships with federal agencies and neighboring PACs, functioning as what Wolf had rebuilt, legitimate governance balancing sovereignty against responsibility, enhancement against accountability, power against principle. Maya watched Morrison depart, saw younger generations stepping into roles that her generation had struggled to establish, continuity that suggested reforms would outlast individuals who'd fought for them. You're thinking about succession. Whether it's time to step back, let others lead while you transition to advisory role. Connor's fully retired. Thomas commands tactical operations. Derek handles training. Morrison represents next generation of leadership. The systems work without requiring my direct involvement for everything. Question is whether stepping back serves the pack or just makes me feel less guilty about staying in charge for so long. She considered the question's seriously military background, recognizing leadership dilemmas that had no perfect answers. James believed that good leaders knew when to delegate, when to step back, when to trust the systems they built. But he also believed that experience mattered, that institutional memory provided value younger leaders couldn't replicate. You don't have to choose between active command and complete retirement. There's middle ground. The decision crystallized over following weeks, Wolf announcing transition plan during PAC assembly. He would remain AlphaKing, but shift daily operations to Command Council, led by Thomas Connor, in advisory role Morrison as junior member, learning governance. Wolf would focus on strategic planning, federal relations, long-term development, while younger leaders handled tactical execution. Leadership isn't about controlling everything personally. It's about building systems robust enough to function without depending on single individual. I've been AlphaKing for 23 years if you count the XL 4 years before that during my original reign. That's long enough. Time to trust the people I've trained, the systems we've built, the culture we've established. The transition happened methodically over 6 months, authority delegating incrementally, while Wolf monitored to ensure nothing critical was lost in handover. Thomas rose to the challenge. Morrison developed quickly with increased responsibility. Derek's training programs maintained quality that kept standards high. The PAC adapted, found that distributed leadership actually improved responsiveness, that multiple perspectives led to better decisions than single commander's judgment. Maya reduced her consulting work, accepted position as PAC's chief strategic officer role that let her focus on long-term planning rather than daily operations. Her security clearances remained active. Washington relationships maintained, but primary commitment was to PAC rather than federal agencies. She'd found purpose in governance that military service had never quite provided, meaningful work that honored her grandfather's sacrifice through sustained institutional improvement. The anniversary of James Reynolds' death became official Memorial Day PAC ceremony, honoring his sacrifice and all soldiers who died protecting truth from convenient lies. Wolf spoke each year, military bearing maintained, despite semi-retirement voice carrying across assembled community. Sergeant Major Reynolds died because he believed accountability mattered more than his own safety. He could have ignored Victor's conspiracy, could have accepted that sometimes good soldiers looked the other way when superiors committed crimes. He chose differently. Chose to document evidence, risk everything, trust that eventually someone would care enough to finish his mission. We're here because he was right. The crowd included Morrison's generation, young adults who'd been children during Valkyrie hearings, veterans who'd served under reform protocols, civilians who'd benefited from governance built on transparency. They represented future that James had died enabling institutional changes that made his sacrifice meaningful rather than tragic. 10 years after the Senate hearings, Caldwell died in federal prison, 15-year sentence reduced to 12 for good behavior, but still long enough that he never returned to freedom. The news reached PAC territory through routine intelligence monitoring, death of elderly man in prison cell marking, end to chapter, that had begun with his authorization of Protocol Omega. Wolf received the notification with an expression suggesting vindication tempered by recognition that one man's death didn't balance scales. He authorized my murder, covered it up for 20 years, destroyed dozens of lives to protect a program that never should have existed. 12 years in prison doesn't seem proportional, but I suppose it's what passes for accountability in systems that protect their own. Maya stood beside him, reviewing the death certificate, official documentation that Caldwell had died of natural causes, no suspicious circumstances, routine end to incarceration that had become his final years. He faced consequences, not perfect justice, but more than many expected. The alternative was that he retired quietly with Pentagon pension and consultant fees, reputation intact, crimes forgotten. James would say, "We got enough accountability to prove the system could work if people pushed it." The memorial service happened at PAC territory rather than any federal facility, gathering for soldier who'd spent final years imprisoned rather than honored. Wolf attended out of principle rather than sympathy witness to end of story that had begun with his Valkyrie recruitment 3 decades prior. Caldwell died believing he had acted within legitimate authority, that his authorization of termination protocols served national security interests. He never understood that power without accountability was tyranny regardless of security justifications. His failure was moral before it was legal, and his death closes account that should never have been opened. Morrison stood nearby, enhanced veteran whose existence proved Caldwell's vision had failed. I'm what Valkyrie 2.0 tried to create: controlled super soldier, obedient asset, enhanced capabilities without inconvenient autonomy. Except their neural interfaces didn't work. Their control systems failed, and I got rescued by people who understood that enhancement doesn't eliminate humanity. Caldwell's legacy isn't the programs he authorized. It's the reforms we built after exposing his crimes. The years continued accumulating packed territory, growing enhanced population, stabilizing federal protocols maturing into accepted practice. Other packs adopted similar governance models, transparency and accountability, spreading through supernatural communities that had traditionally operated on authority rather than consent. The changes weren't universal, resistance remained, but trajectory favored reform over regression. Maya's grandmother died peacefully at 93, long life that had outlasted both her husband's murder and the conspiracy's exposure. The funeral brought PAC members who'd never met James Reynolds, but understood his importance to institutional change. Wolf delivered eulogy, enhanced soldier honoring the widow who'd waited decades for truth to vindicate her husband's sacrifice. She believed in James even when official records called him traitor, believed in truth when convenience favored lies, believed that eventually accountability would emerge if people cared enough to keep pushing. She was right, and her faith sustained Maya through the work of finishing what James started. We honor her by continuing to build systems worthy of their sacrifice. The memorial beside James's added her name together in death after being separated by conspiracy and life recognition that families paid costs when soldiers chose principle over expedience. Maya stood between the Stone's daughter and granddaughter of service members who'd understood that duty sometimes meant defying orders that contradicted deeper obligations. 15 years after the Senate hearings packed territory celebrated Thomas's promotion to colonel, formal recognition that he'd become primary operational commander, while Wolf transitioned fully to strategic advisory role. Morrison, now 32, took over tactical operations, Marine turned PAC officer, leading response teams with competence that suggested natural aptitude for command. The ceremony happened in Great Hall. PAC members gathered, federal observers attending, recognition that transitions mattered as much as continuity. Wolf administered the oath, personally enhanced soldier passing authority to successor who'd earned rank through sustained excellence rather than political maneuvering. Colonel Drake, you've served with integrity and competence for 15 years. You've led operations that saved lives, trained operators who maintain our standards, built programs that balance capability against accountability. This promotion recognizes what you've already been doing, leading our tactical operations with wisdom that makes me confident about PAC's future. Thomas's acceptance speech was characteristically brief. I serve people who rescued me from a regime that ran on fear. I lead operators who understand that enhancement requires responsibility. I command with knowledge that authority without accountability becomes oppression. That's the standard Colonel Wolf established, and that's what I'll maintain. The celebration continued into evening, PAC members relaxing in ways that would have been impossible under Victor's paranoid security culture. Children played, families gathered, veterans told stories about operations conducted and threats neutralized, community thriving because governance worked. Wolf stood with Maya overlooking the assembly, two people who had spent decades building systems to prevent institutional failures. We did what James wanted: exposed conspiracy, established accountability, built frameworks that survive beyond individuals. Next generation is leading now, maintaining standards we established while adapting to circumstances we couldn't predict. That's sustainability. Maya leaned against him, physical contact that had become comfortable after years of professional partnership evolving into something deeper. He'd approve, would say we honored his sacrifice by finishing the mission properly, by choosing reform over revenge, by trusting systems over personalities. Not perfect, nothing involving humans is perfect, but good enough to prove institutions can learn from failures if people care enough to teach the lessons. The future stretched forward, continuation rather than conclusion, work that would outlast everyone currently doing it. Packed territory would grow, federal protocols would evolve, enhanced populations would integrate or remain separate based on circumstances nobody could entirely predict. But foundation was solid principles, established trajectory, favoring justice over expedience. 27 years after James Reynolds died protecting evidence, his granddaughter stood beside memorial bearing his name, work complete in ways that mattered, while recognizing that institutional maintenance never truly finished. She thought about the 15-year-old who'd watched military officers deliver folded flag, who'd known even then that official story didn't match the grandfather she remembered. That girl would barely recognize what Maya had become: military veteran, strategic officer leader, who'd helped rebuild governance from conspiracy's wreckage. But she'd understand that the work honored sacrifice rather than pursuing vengeance, that the best memorial was institutional improvement rather than personal retribution. The sun set behind mountains that had witnessed everything: Wolf's exile, Maya's insertion, the raids and hearings, and slow progress toward accountability. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new requests for enhanced response, new questions about balancing sovereignty against responsibility. The work continued because it had to, because systems required maintenance and vigilance came at cost of sustained attention. But tonight, packed territory celebrated leadership transition that represented continuity rather than disruption in next generation, stepping forward to carry standards that previous generation had established through sacrifice and persistence and stubborn refusal to let institutional failures go unchallenged. That was James Reynolds' legacy, not the man himself lost to conspiracy 27 years earlier, but the principles he died protecting and the people who'd finished his mission by choosing justice over expedience, truth over convenience, reform over retribution. The memorial stood witness as the celebration continued, granite monument to soldier who'd believed that institutions could be better if people fought to improve them, that sacrifice mattered. If successors completed what martyrs started, that truth eventually found light, if someone cared enough to keep pursuing it through darkness. That was enough.